Welcome back to Harry's Verse. Today's What If takes us here. What if Harry Potter woke in his first year remembering the war and conquered before it began? Before we begin, if you haven't yet, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The second waking he died the way a candle dies in a cathedral. One small fire among 1,000 that had already gone dark, and the last thing his war body knew was the cold coming up through the flagstones of a ruined great hall that no longer had a roof. There had been a green light and then there had been no light at all, and between the two there had been an ocean. It was not a metaphor. He would think about that afterward in the years and the hours he did not yet have, and he would decide that whatever waited at the end of a wizard's life was less a place than a pressure, a black tide with weight in it, salt in it, the drowned voices of everyone who had ever gone under. He went into it. He felt his name unstitch. He felt the war he had lost, the long strangling war, the one that ate his godfather and his teachers and the two friends he would have died for and did in the end die beside. He felt all of it lift off him like a cloak of drowned wool, and for the length of one immeasurable breath he was nothing, and nothing was a mercy. Then the tide reversed. The pressure that had pulled him down took hold of his ankles and hauled, and the ocean poured upward through him in a single reversed cataract, memory rushing back into a vessel too small to hold it, a decade of loss forced into a body that had lived a decade and no more. Light returned first as a smell, dust, and boiled cabbage and the sour breath of a house that hated him, and then as a bar of gray morning coming crooked through a vent no wider than a letter slot. He heard a clock. He heard a woman's voice pitched to a nail's edge. He heard, very close and very far, the faint animal complaint of springs under his own thin back. His hands came up in front of his face and they were wrong. They were a child's hands, unscarred, the knuckles smooth where they should have been ruined, the fingers short, the nails bitten to a boy's ragged crescents. He turned them in the gray light and found no burns, no white seam from the splinter of a curse that had opened his forearm to the bone in a corridor he could still walk in his mind step for step. The war had written itself into his flesh for years. Now the pages were blank, and the wrongness of that blankness was the first thing that told him he was not dreaming, because no dream he had ever suffered had bothered to be so precise about the absence of pain. He lay in the cupboard under the stairs and did not move, and he let the ocean settle in him, and he counted. 2 lives. He had 2 lives now, one lived forward and one apparently about to be lived again, and the second was starting from a point so early that the disaster of the first had not yet grown its first tooth. The mattress under him was the mattress of a 10-year-old. The spider that lived in the corner of the vent was the spider he remembered. On the shelf above his head, at the exact tilt he remembered, sat a broken plastic soldier he had not thought about, and what his mind insisted was 15 years and his body insisted was last week. The date. He needed the date the way a drowning man needs the surface, and he found it as he had learned to find everything in the war, by triangulation, by inference, by refusing to want a comfortable answer. Aunt Petunia's voice through the door had the particular shrillness of a summer morning with Dudley's birthday somewhere in the near distance. The light was long and low. The heat that would come later had not yet come, late July then. As for the year, it announced itself in the ache of a specific hunger, in the smallness of the hands, in the fact that no scar on his forehead had ever hurt because the thing that lived behind it had not yet come close enough to wake. 1991. He was 10 years old, 4 days from 11, and in a handful of those days an owl would begin trying to deliver a letter, and a giant would break down a door, and the whole machinery of his ruin would start turning over like an engine in the cold. He had been given the war to do again from the beginning, and this time he knew where every mine was buried. He should have felt something enormous. He was aware, in the clinical back room of himself where he did his thinking now, that a younger man would have wept or prayed or gone to pieces against the impossibility of it. He had wept all the weeping out of himself years ago in a tent in a wood while the whole world narrowed to the names of the dead. What came instead was colder and more useful. It came like the moment before a duel when the noise falls away and time turns to syrup and you can see laid out in front of you every angle your enemy has left open. He was in that moment. He suspected he would be in that moment for a long time. He made himself lie still until Petunia stopped shrieking and the household thundered off to breakfast, and in the dark he began methodically to take inventory of everything he knew and everyone he was going to have to move. Start with the enemy, because the enemy was always the fixed point around which the rest of the board arranged itself. Voldemort was not, in the summer of 1991, a person. He was a wound that had learned to want. His body had been unmade the night he tried to kill an infant and the curse turned on its caster, and what remained of him had spent 10 years as less than a ghost, a smear of appetite drifting through the forests of Albania, feeding on snakes, waiting. Right now, this very morning, that smear had already found its way home. It was riding the back of a stammering defense professor's skull under a purple turban, and it was coming to Hogwarts to steal a stone that could give it back a body and give it worse, the thing it had wanted since it was an unloved child in an orphanage, a life that would not end. And Voldemort was not one thing. That was the secret the entire First War had died for want of. He had split his soul. 6 times he had torn it and hidden the pieces in objects, and once, by an accident of overreach he did not himself understand, in the skull of the child he had failed to murder. A diary, a ring, a locket, a cup, a diadem, a boy. Kill the wraith without finding the anchors and you killed nothing at all. You only sent the appetite back to Albania to wait and grow patient again. He knew this now as he knew his own name, better even than he knew his own name, because his own name was a thing that had drowned in the tide and come back slightly wrong. He knew where the anchors were, all of them. He had spent a year of the first life hunting them across a country at war, half-starved, hunted, guessing, and paying for every guess in blood. Now the map was already drawn inside his skull. The diary sat in a drawer in Malfoy Manor, its owner not yet aware of what he held. The ring sat under a rotting floorboard in a shack in a valley in the Midlands, wrapped around a cursed stone that would one day rot the hand of the greatest wizard alive. The locket sat in a cave and then in a house in London, guarded by a house elf whose loyalty was a door Harry alone knew how to open. The cup sat in a vault under a bank, behind dragons and goblin law. The diadem sat in a room in the castle that would only open for someone who knew to ask. And the last anchor lay behind his own eyes, and that one he would have to be clever about than he had ever been about anything, because the standard method of removing it involved his own death. He turned his ruined and not truant hands over once more and stopped cataloging the enemy, because the enemy was, in a sense, the easy part. The enemy was a machine with known inputs. The harder problem sat behind a half-moon pair of spectacles and smiled at you while it arranged for you to die. Dumbledore. He held the thought of the old man carefully, the way you hold a blade you respect. He would not make the child's mistake the first life had made of turning the old man into a simple villain. A villain was a poor instrument of thought. It read the world in only one color and missed everything else. Dumbledore had been kind to him in his fashion and had also raised him the way a farmer raises a pig he intends one day to need, with real affection and an eye always on the appointed morning. The old man knew about the fragment behind Harry's scar, had known for years, had built a whole long, tender education around the single fact that Harry would, at the necessary hour, have to walk into a forest and let Voldemort kill him, so that the piece of Voldemort inside him would die too. It had worked. In the first life it had worked exactly as designed, and Harry had walked into the trees and knelt and taken the green light, and it had cost him nothing less than everything, and it had still in the end not been enough, because there had been mistakes downstream that no one had planned for. He did not resent the plan. He resented the concealment. He resented being a weapon that was never told it was a weapon. And he had learned, dying, the single most important thing anyone could ever learn about Albus Dumbledore, that the old man's power was almost entirely a power of information. He knew more than everyone else and moved everyone else through the gaps in what they didn't know. Take that away, meet him already knowing, and you did not defeat him exactly, but you made him something he had not been in half a century. You made him surprised. Harry lay in the dark under the stairs and for the space of one breath allowed himself the luxury of the plan's shape, not the details, the shape. He would not spend this life being moved. He would move. He would reach the anchors before anyone knew there were anchors to reach and unmake them one by one with the one weapon in Britain that could do it, and he would strangle the coming war in its cradle while it was still small enough to strangle. He would not save the world by dying in it. He would take the board apart before the game began, and when it was done he would not hand the pieces back to the men who had spent them so freely the first time. It was, he understood, an appalling amount to want. He wanted it anyway. He got up. The cupboard was so low he had forgotten a body could be small enough not to have to stoop in it, and the novelty of standing without pain in his knees was its own small vertigo. He dressed in Dudley's cast-offs, and the cloth hung on him like a flag on a windless day, and he looked at himself in the warped scrap of mirror propped on the shelf and studied the face that looked back. It was a stranger's face, and it was his. Round still, the bones of the man he would become not yet arrived under the skin. The eyes were the only thing that fit. They were older than the rest of him by a war, and they knew it, and they did not blink when he told them what they were about to do. Downstairs, the family was arranged around the wreckage of breakfast in their usual order of magnitude. Vernon a purpling planet, Petunia a thin cold moon, Dudley an appetite in a chair. Harry came in and every instinct he had spent a decade sharpening told him how to be. Not the sullen, crushed thing they were used to. Not defiant either. Defiance invited attention, and attention was expensive. He wanted to be, for the 4 days he still had to spend in this house, exactly as unremarkable as a piece of furniture that had learned to fetch the milk. "There's post," he said, before Petunia could set him a task, and put the letters by Vernon's plate and stepped back out of the blast radius, and this alone was so out of pattern that Vernon looked at him for a full second with the suspicion of a man who has found a door he was sure he locked standing open. Harry looked at the floor and let the suspicion die of hunger. He had learned that too. Most suspicion starved if you fed it nothing. He knew what was coming. The first letter would arrive today or tomorrow, addressed to the cupboard under the stairs, and Vernon would burn it, and more would come, and the tide of parchment would rise until the family fled to a shack on a rock in the sea, and Hagrid came through the door with a birthday cake and a pink umbrella and the news. He knew every beat of it. And the thing about knowing every beat of a thing was that you could, if you were patient and quiet and very sure of your footing, change any note in the score without the orchestra ever realizing the music had changed. He did not want the letters burned. Burned letters meant the flight to the rock, and the flight to the rock meant Hagrid, and Hagrid was a door he intended to walk through with his eyes open rather than have kicked in for him. But he could not simply announce that he was a wizard. A 10-year-old in a cupboard who announced such things got a doctor, not a wand. He needed the machinery to deliver him to Diagon Alley on schedule, and he needed, when he got there, to already be someone other than the lamb he had been the first time. So he let the morning run its course, and he watched, and he began quietly, without a single word out of place, to gather the operational facts that a war teaches you never to be without. Where the spare key hung, what Petunia did with the housekeeping money and where, which floorboard on the landing announced a footstep and which did not. The habits of a house he had once merely endured he now surveyed because a soldier surveys everything, and he was a soldier wearing a child like an ill-fitting coat. The first letter came the next morning, and it came exactly as he remembered. The heavy cream envelope with the emerald ink, emerald, the exact green of the light that had killed him, addressed in that looping hand to Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs. Vernon took it off the mat with the letters and the bills, and Harry watched the man's face go through its little apocalypse, the flush, the pallor, the fist closing on the parchment. Harry could have fought for it. In the first life he had fought for it, snatched and shouted and been locked away, and it had changed nothing except how many letters it took. He did not fight for it now. He let Vernon burn it in the grate and pretended not to care, and he ate his half-slice of toast, and inside the war room of himself he made a single adjustment to the plan, because he did not, in fact, need the letters at all. He had a better door, and it had a name, and the name lived at a bank in an alley behind a wall behind a pub, and it had never in 1,000 years of grudging service to wizard-kind cared in the slightest what a child's aunt and uncle wanted. The letters would keep coming, he would let them. The flood would drive the family to the rock, he would let it. But when Hagrid finally came, Harry did not intend to arrive at Diagon Alley as a bewildered orphan to be walked from shop to shop and shown his own money like a treat. He intended to arrive as an account holder returning to a bank that owed him, by ancient contract, a very great deal more than anyone had ever thought to tell him. The rock, when they came to it 3 days later, was exactly as cold and exactly as loud with the sea as it had been the first time, and the storm outside the leaning shack was the same storm, and Harry lay on the floor by the dead fire and watched the second hand of Dudley's watch crawl toward midnight and toward the morning of his 11th birthday. And he did not tremble, and he did not thrill to it, and he permitted himself the one word. The single-named thing he would allow himself in all the long cold days ahead. He was, underneath everything, grieving, because his mother was alive, because somewhere in a photograph he had not yet been given, and in a cottage that had already burned, and in the impossible arithmetic of a life lived backward, Lily and James Potter were 10 years dead and would stay dead, and there was nothing in all his terrible foreknowledge that could reach back far enough to save them, and there never would be. That door was shut before the war began. He could unmake Voldemort. He could not unmake the night that had already happened. And so it sat in him where it always sat, low and constant, a stone he had learned to walk with, and he let himself feel it for exactly as long as the second hand took to reach 12, and then he put it down because there was a fist about to hammer on the door and a giant on the other side of it, and it was a passenger he could not afford to let take the wheel. The door came off its hinges. Hagrid filled the frame the way weather fills a sky, streaming rain, huge, his beetle eyes finding the pale shapes of the Dursleys and dismissing them, finding the slight figure by the fire and softening into something that hurt to look at because it was so plainly, uncomplicatedly kind. Harry got to his feet. He did not cower and he did not gape. He looked up at the enormous man who had carried him out of the ruins of his parents' house as an infant, the man who would in another life dig his grave and weep over it, and he found that his voice, when it came, was steady in a way that made Hagrid blink. "You'd be Hagrid," Harry said, "keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts." The giant's mouth opened under the wild beard. "Yeah." "How'd yeah, you've got a Hogwarts look about you," Harry said, which was nonsense and disarming for exactly that reason, and he watched the big man decide to be charmed rather than unsettled. It was the first move of the second life, and it was a small one, and it worked, and something in Harry that had been holding very still since the ocean loosened a single notch. The machine could be steered, he had just steered it. The rest of the night ran on rails he laid himself. He let Hagrid tell him he was a wizard, and he let his face do the work of a child hearing it, because there were kinds of knowledge a child was allowed to have and kinds he was not, and Harry intended to be caught holding only the permitted kind. He asked the questions a clever, hungry orphan would ask. He did not ask the questions a general would ask, though the general sat behind his eyes taking notes. When Vernon roared about not paying for any of it, Harry watched Hagrid produce the umbrella and give Dudley his tail, and he let his face do the wonder a child's face would do, and underneath the performance he thought, "The man is powerful, expelled but not disarmed, loyal to Dumbledore past all reason, and completely, gloriously unable to keep a secret, an asset, handled gently." "There's money," Harry said into a lull, testing. "My parents left me money, you said." "Course they did." Hagrid looked almost offended by the doubt. "Yeah, Don think they left you with nothin'. It's all in Gringotts, safest place in the world fur anything you want kept safe, 'cept maybe Hogwarts." "I'd like to see it," Harry said. "I'd like to understand it, all of it." And he let the sentence be a child's simple greed, and he meant it as a soldier means a supply line. They went to London in the grey after the storm, and the leaky cauldron swallowed them, and the low dark room did the thing it always did to Harry Potter, which was recognize him. The pub went quiet, chairs scraped. A dozen witches and wizards came up to shake the hand of the child who had ended the last war before it was properly a war, and Harry gave them the shy, grateful face they wanted and read their names off the map in his skull as they came. Doris Crockford 3 times. Daedalus Diggle dropping his hat, a pale, twitching man in a great purple turban hanging back at the edge of the crowd, waiting to be introduced. Harry felt the man before Hagrid named him. It was not a mystical thing, or not only. It was recognition, and it was the specific crawl along a scar that would not begin to properly hurt for another 2 months. a faint hot wire under the skin of his forehead that told him, plainly as a spoken word, what stood inside that turban, and pressed its ruined face to the back of that skull and looked out at the world through borrowed eyes. "Harry," said Hagrid, beaming down at him, "this is Professor Quirrell. He'll be one o' your teachers at Hogwarts." "P.P. Potter," Quirrell stammered, putting out a thin, damp hand. "See, can't tell you how pleased I am to meet you." Harry took the hand. It was a thing a lesser player would never have done, and a thing a more cautious mind could not have made itself do, and Harry did it because information was worth a little pain, and because he needed, before this life truly began, to feel with his own skin exactly how much of the enemy had already arrived on the board. The scar sang. Behind Quirrell's watery eyes something vast and cold turned over and looked back at him, incurious, a wraith too weak and too fixated on a certain stone to give a child a second glance. It did not know him. That was the whole gift of the moment. The most dangerous thing in the world was standing close enough to smell the garlic Quirrell wore against the vampires of his own invention, and it had no idea that the pleasant little orphan gripping its host's hand had already watched it die. "The pleasure's mine, Professor," Harry said, and let the hand go and let his face be nothing but a boy's polite blankness. "I'm looking forward to defense." Quirrell's stammer redoubled into something about the D-dark arts and the P-practicalities, and Harry made the right encouraging noises and stepped back into Hagrid's shadow, and the wire in his forehead cooled, and he kept, behind his eyes, the one fact he had come to the leaky cauldron to confirm. The wraith was here, it was weak, it was blind to him, and it was walking on a stammering man's legs straight toward a trap it did not yet know Harry would build for it. Then the wall opened its brick throat onto the alley, and Harry walked into Diagon Alley for the first time in his life. He had braced for it, and it undid him anyway, a little the sheer living clutter of the wizarding world before the war had gutted it. The shopfronts not yet boarded, the crowds not yet thinned by burial and flight, the owls and the cauldrons and the broomsticks, the whole loud, unkilled thing of it. In the first life, this had been a wonderland. Now he walked through it, seeing the ghosts it did not yet have, the boarded windows it did not yet wear, the names on shop fronts that would in 6 years be names on a memorial wall. He let none of it show. A tourist gapes. He was not a tourist. He was a man walking back through a house he had watched burn, taking the measurements he would need to keep it from burning. Gringotts rose white and crooked at the head of the alley, and the goblin at the great bronze doors bowed them in over the warning carved in the marble about thieves and the price of greed, and Harry read it, and thought that of all the peoples of the magical world, the goblins were the only ones who had never once lied to him about what they were. "I'd like to visit my vault," he told the teller at the high counter before Hagrid could speak, and he said it in the flat, courteous register of someone who has done business here before, and the goblin's black eyes came down to him with a flicker of reassessment. "Harry Potter, and I'd like, if it can be arranged, a word with someone senior about the management of the Potter account. There are questions I should have had answered before now." Hagrid, beside him, made a sound of vague, benevolent confusion. The goblin did not. The goblin looked at the child in the enormous cast-off coat for a moment, and then looked at the key Hagrid produced from a pocket, and then did the thing Harry had been counting on, the thing goblins did that wizards never expected. He took the request seriously because it was a request about property, and property was the one thing goblins never treated as a child's game. "The Potter key," the goblin said, turning it in his long fingers. "And you wish an accounting." "I wish an accounting," Harry agreed. What followed took the better part of the morning, and Hagrid spent most of it in an antechamber with a tankard of something called away. Besides, on the errand Harry remembered the grubby package from Vault 713, the stone itself, riding to Hogwarts in a giant's pocket. Harry let him go. He wanted Hagrid out of the room for what came next, and the stone's journey was a thing he did not yet need to touch. Let it go to the castle. He knew where it was going and who was coming for it, and exactly how that particular story ended, and he had bigger vaults to open than the one under the third-floor corridor. The goblin who received him in the deep office was named Bogrod, and he was old, and he had the incurious patience of something that measured its life in centuries and its business in fractions of a percent. Harry sat in a chair built for smaller and harder people and did not fidget, and he laid out, in the clean, spare language he had learned to use with creatures who despised waste, exactly what he wanted. "I want to know what I own," he said. "Not the trust vault. The trust vault, I understand, it's an allowance and it's meant to run out. I want to know what stands behind it. I am the last of the Potter line. My grandparents were wealthy. My parents did not spend that wealth into the ground in the year they had. Somewhere in this bank there's a family vault that no one has mentioned to me, and there are, unless the whole of wizarding inheritance law is a fiction, titles and holdings attached to my name that I have never been told about because I have been kept very deliberately in a cupboard." Bogrod's quill had stopped. "You are 11 years of age today," the goblin observed. "I am," Harry said, "and I would still like an accounting." "Does the bank object to giving a client an accounting of his own estate on the grounds that he is young?" There was a silence, and in the silence something shifted in the goblin's ancient face, a thing that was not warmth, because goblins had no warmth to spare for wizards, but was its close, cold cousin, respect. Respect for a client who knew the bank's own rules and meant to hold it to them. "The bank does not object," Bogrod said. "The bank has never objected. It is the wizards who set the accounting aside." He set down the quill. "There is a family vault, its management passed on the death of your parents to the executor named in your father's will, and that executor is Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore." Harry did not react, because reacting would have taught the goblin something about him that he did not wish the goblin to know. He merely nodded once as at the confirmation of a thing already suspected. Of course it was. Of course the man who had arranged for him to die had also held the keys to everything his death would have made ownerless. I'd like an inheritance test, Harry said. The blood ritual, I know the bank offers it. I want to know precisely what lines run to me and what comes with them, and I want it on parchment I can keep, witnessed by the bank, so that no one can tell me later that I imagined it. They brought the basin and the silver knife, and Harry gave the required 3 drops without flinching, watching his own blood spread in the clear liquid and resolve as the old magic read it into a branching column of names in ink that rose out of nothing. He read it as it wrote itself. Potter, of course, the main line unbroken to him. Through his father's grandmother, the older, colder name he had been waiting for, Peveril. The third brother's line, the one that ended in a cloak that turned a man invisible even to death, the one that made him on parchment and in a way no one had ever bothered to tell him, an heir of the oldest story in the magical world. And beside the names, the holdings. The family vault deep in the bank, its contents listed in a column that ran off the bottom of the page. A cottage in Godric's Hollow, ruined, held in trust. A seat in the Wisengamot, the High Court and Legislature of magical Britain, held dormant, its proxy assigned since 1981 to the executor of the estate. His proxy, his voice in the government of the wizarding world, held all this time by the man who smiled at him and called him a good boy and meant to spend him. Harry read the parchment twice, and then he looked up at Bogrod and he asked the question that turned an accounting into a campaign. The proxy, he said. Wisengamot's seat, can it be reclaimed by the heir before his majority or only after? Ordinarily only after, said Bogrod. At 17, a pause, and the goblin's black eyes glittered. There are instruments, a regency can be dissolved for cause, an executor can be examined, and if his management is found wanting, his authority withdrawn. Such things require an advocate and gold, and a client willing to make an enemy of a powerful man. I have gold, Harry said. I'll find an advocate. And I have never in my life been short of powerful enemies. I'd simply prefer this time to know which ones I have. He walked out of Gringotts an hour later with a copy of the accounting sealed in an inner pocket, a heavier purse than Hagrid knew, and a line of communication open to a bank that had just decided in its slow granite way that this particular Potter was worth watching. Hagrid was waiting with the ruffled ease of a man who had done his job, and the grubby little package from Vault 713 was already gone into the depths of his coat. And Harry looked at the pocket that held the Philosopher's Stone and thought about how in another life he had nearly died for the privilege of keeping that stone from a wraith, and how in this life he would let the wraith have its chance at it and lose, because a wraith that failed at the stone was a wraith that could be hunted at leisure. And he had a great deal of hunting to do before he needed to worry about a stone at all. The rest of the shopping he let run more or less as it had. He bought the robes, and Hagrid bought him the owl, and he took Hedwig with an openness he allowed himself nowhere else that day, because Hedwig was innocent and loyal and had died for him once already, and this time he intended to keep her alive. He bought the cauldron and the scales and the books, and to the standard list he quietly added others, older ones, a text on wizarding law and a treatise on the theory of the soul that the shopkeeper sold him with a raised eyebrow and no questions, because Flourish and Blotts had learned long ago that eccentric purchases were the store's whole business. And then last, Ollivanders, because a soldier without a wand is a man shouting at the weather, and Harry had spent the whole day with his hands empty and hated it. The shop was as narrow and dust-hushed as he remembered, 10,000 slim boxes stacked to a ceiling lost in shadow, the smell of it old wood and older magic. Ollivander came out of the stacks as he always did, a pale man with moon-silver eyes that saw more than was comfortable, and he looked at Harry with the particular attention he reserved for the ones who interested him. I wondered when I would see you, Mr. Potter, the old man said softly. It seems only yesterday your mother and father were in here buying their first wands. He drew nearer, and the moon eyes searched Harry's face. You have her eyes. And you carry yourself, a pause, a flicker of puzzlement crossing the ancient features, you carry yourself older than you are, curious. I've had a serious sort of year, Harry said. Ollivander measured him and set the tape flying and brought out the boxes, and Harry let the ritual proceed because there was one wand in this shop that was his and no other, and he knew which, and he knew he could not simply name it. He tried the ones the old man offered and set them down as they failed, and he watched Ollivander brighten and then sharpen into intent. And when at last the wandmaker went very still and came back from the deep stacks with a particular box, Harry knew before it was open what was inside. Holly, 11 inches. A single phoenix feather at its core. He took it, and the warmth ran up his arm the way it had the first time, gold and sudden and complete, red and gold sparks falling from the tip like the last of a fireworks. And for one baroque and unguarded instant the whole grim architecture of his plan fell away, and he was only a boy holding the first thing in 2 lifetimes that had ever felt, unarguably, like it belonged to him. Then the instant passed, and Ollivander told him the thing Harry already knew, told it in a hushed, unhappy voice that the phoenix who gave this feather had given only one other, and that the wand made from that other feather was the wand that had given Harry the scar. Brother wands, twin cores, bound to each other in a way that would, one appalling night in a graveyard, save Harry's life when the two refused to fight. Curious, Ollivander breathed. Curious indeed. You keep saying that, Harry said, closing his hand around the holly, and he looked up at the moon-eyed old man with the calm of someone who has read the last page of the book he is holding. You think it means the wand chose me for something terrible, that the Brotherhood is a kind of doom. He paid his 7 galleons and tucked the wand away against his ribs where he could feel it. It isn't doom, Mr. Ollivander, it's leverage. A thing that cannot bring itself to strike me is a thing I know how to survive, and a thing I know how to survive is a thing I've already half beat. He left the old man staring after him in the dust, and he walked back up the alley into the failing light with Hagrid's shadow enormous and gentle at his side. The body kept betraying him in small ways, and he catalogued each betrayal the way a commander notes the failings of new equipment. His legs tired after a mile of cobbles that would once have been nothing. His hands, closing on the wand box, remembered a grip they had never learned and fumbled the one they had. When a witch bumped him near Flourish and Blots, he came up to the buckle of her cloak and had to look a long way up to read her face, and some animal part of him, the 10-year-old part that still lived in the meat and bone of him, flinched at being so small in a crowd of the tall. He noted the flinch. He would train it out. A war room in a nursery still had to run on the nursery's stunted power, 3 feet of it, unbroken voice and soft, unscarred hands, and the discipline the second life would demand of him was not the discipline of courage but the harder one of patience, of doing everything at a child's pace while thinking at the speed of a man who had already lost everything once. The whole loud, unkilled world of it moved around him, and Harry Potter, 10 years dead and 11 years old, went over his map one final time in the clean, cold room behind his eyes. 6 anchors and a wraith, a bank that would deal with him, a government seat held in his enemy's hand and a path, however narrow, to take it back, a giant who trusted him, a serpent sleeping under a school, older than the school, waiting in the dark for a voice it would obey. And most of all, the one thing no one else on the board had, the thing that made a child in a coat too big for him the single most dangerous person in magical Britain on the last evening of July in 1991. He knew how the story ended, and he had absolutely no intention of letting it end that way again. The letters had done their work. The door had opened. He had walked through it on his own feet, with his own gold, holding his own wand, and no one, not the wraith in Albania, not the old man behind his half-moon glasses, not the whole slow machinery of a world that had once ground him to powder. No one had the faintest idea that the game had already quietly, in a dusty shop at the end of an alley, begun to change hands. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The Serpent Beneath the School. He found the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 without help, which was the first small proof that the second life would not require the same humiliations as the first. In the old telling, he had stood on King's Cross like a lost parcel until a red-haired woman took him under her wing and told him the trick of the wall. He did not need her now. He walked the concourse with his trolley and his owl, small among the commuters, and when he reached the seam in the brick between the 2 platforms, he leaned his weight into it without breaking stride and let the world of the mundane swallow him and spit him out beneath a wrought iron arch that read Platform 9 3/4, and the Hogwarts Express stood steaming scarlet under it, and children and trunks and cats and the cries of parting mothers filled the smoke. He boarded early and took a compartment near the rear, and he sat by the window with his back to the wall, because a man who has been ambushed once learns not to sit where he cannot see the door. The Weasleys arrived in their loud, close-knit cluster, and he watched them through the glass the way you watch a photograph of the dead come to life. There was Molly, round and fierce and utterly alive, whom he had last seen screaming a curse across a broken hall at the woman who had just tried to kill her daughter. There were the twins, whole, both of them, neither yet missing an ear nor a life. There was Percy being pompous, and Ginny too young to come, jumping to see the train, and Ron scuffing along at the back with a smudge on his nose and a fat gray rat asleep in his hands. Harry looked at the rat for a long moment. Peter Pettigrew slept in a first-year's fist not 30 feet away, and every instinct in Harry wanted to cross the platform and take the vermin by the tail and end, in one motion, the man who had sold his parents to their killer and would one day cut off his own hand to bring that killer back. He did none of it. A dead rat in a boy's hand on Platform 9 3/4 was a mystery that would draw exactly the wrong kind of attention, and Pettigrew was not merely a debt to be paid, he was a key. Alive in animal form, hidden in a family Dumbledore trusted, Pettigrew was the single cleanest lever in Britain for prying an innocent man out of Azkaban. Kill him now and Sirius Black rotted for another 2 years. Keep him and produce him at the correct moment before the correct audience, and a wizard the whole world believed a murderer walked free and grateful and dangerous and loyal and stood at Harry's shoulder. So he watched the rat and let it live, and he let the ache of it settle in with all the others. Ron found his compartment, of course, because some grooves the world cut deep enough that even a changed river ran partly in them. He hovered in the doorway, ears pink. Everywhere else is full, do you mind? Sit, Harry said, and gestured at the opposite seat and made his voice easy. He liked Ron. That was the trouble with all of it, the thing that made the second life heavier than the first rather than lighter. He knew this freckled, gawky, generous child would grow into a man who abandoned him in a forest, and then came back through fire and ice to save his life, who married a brilliant witch and named a son after 2 dead headmasters, who was, when it mattered, one of the 2 bravest people Harry had ever bled beside. And he could not have him, not as he had once had him. You cannot be 11 with someone when you are a war behind their eyes. You can only protect them from a distance and let them think you strange. So he talked to Ron lightly and asked the questions a curious orphan would ask, and learned nothing he did not already know, and let Ron eat most of the sweets off the trolley because Ron's mother had packed him corned beef he hated, and Harry remembered that too. When Hermione came looking for Toad with her hair already a wild storm and her voice already too fast and too eager to be liked, he was kind to her, because in the first life he had been careless with her at the start and had nearly lost her to a mountain troll for it, and he did not intend to repeat any avoidable cruelty. He answered her rapid questions. He complimented the one thing she'd done well and ignored the officiousness, and he watched her decide warily that he was not laughing at her, and go away a fraction less lonely than she had come. When Draco Malfoy appeared in the doorway flanked by his two slabs of muscle, pale and smug and already reciting the Catechism of Blood, Harry looked at him and saw under the sneer a cornered child performing lines his father had taught him. He did not take the offered hand and he did not slap it away. He said mildly that he thought he'd choose his friends himself, thanks, and he said it without the heat the first Harry had used, and Draco, who fed on reaction, found nothing to feed on and withdrew confused. That too was a move. A boy who wounded Draco's vanity made an enemy. A boy who declined to be impressed made an uncertainty, and an uncertainty could be worked on later. The castle rose out of the black water exactly as it always had, 1,000 windows burning gold against the mountains, and something in Harry that did not answer to strategy went quiet at the sight of it. He had died in that castle. He had also grown up in it, been happier in it than anywhere, buried friends in its grounds. He let himself look at it for the length of the boat ride and no longer, and then he went in through the great doors to be sorted and to face the first mind in the world that would see straight through him. The sorting hat was a problem he had lain awake over. It read minds, not the surface, the whole of them, the deep silt at the bottom. It would put its awareness inside his skull, and it would find not a child's 11 thin years but an ocean, a whole drowned war, a second life folded impossibly into a first. He had spent the summer teaching his infant occlumency what he could, walling the worst of it behind old disciplines, but the hat was not a legilimens to be shut out. It was invited in by the ritual itself, and to refuse it was to refuse the sorting, which no one did. So he had chosen instead of concealment to negotiate. Professor McGonagall called the names, and the stool waited, and the ragged old hat sang its song about the four founders and the houses of the brave and the wise and the loyal and the cunning, and the first years went up one by one and were sorted into their futures. Then she called Potter, Harry, and the hall did the thing it always did, the ripple of whispers, the craning necks, the name passed hand to hand like a coin. He walked up through it with his face composed and sat on the stool, and McGonagall lowered the hat over his eyes, and the world went dark under old felt, and a voice spoke in the private dark of his head. Well, said the hat, and then it said nothing at all for a long moment, and Harry felt it go still around the edges of his mind the way a man goes still at the top of a stair he thought was solid. Well, this is new. In 1,000 years and more I have sorted the mad and the haunted and the possessed. I have never yet sorted a grave. I'm not dead. Harry thought at it clearly, the way you speak slowly to something you need on your side. Not anymore. I remember it. I remember all of it, every year, the whole war, the end. I've come back to the start with the memory intact. You're the first thing to know it, and I need you to be the last for a while. The hat turned this over in the vast, slow way of very old things. You could lie to me, it observed. Children try. But you are not lying, and that is the more troubling for it, because I can taste the truth of a thing, and this taste of ash and salt and a green light I have watched fall on this hall before. It paused. You mean to change it, all of it. I mean to end it before it starts, Harry thought. And I would rather you didn't announce that to the man at the center table. I'm bound to counsel not to gossip, the hat said with something that in a hat might have been dignity. What passes under my brim stays under my brim. It has done for 1,000 years, and it will do for you. The old ones sat here and I kept their secrets, and I will keep yours. But hear me, Revenant. I see what you are and I see what you want, and there is only one house in this castle built for a mind that has already died once and come back meaning to remake the board. You know it. You have known it since before you sat down. You did not come here to be brave. Bravery is for people who do not yet know how the story ends. You came here to win. Then you know where I belong, Harry thought. You belong, the hat said, and Harry felt it draw the breath it did not have, in the only house that has ever understood that survival is the first virtue and everything else is decoration. Slytherin, the word cracked across the hall, and the hall did not cheer. It fell silent instead, a silence with a texture to it, hundreds of faces turning to stone as the arithmetic ran through them all at once. The boy who lived, the child who had broken the Dark Lord, the son of 2 Order martyrs, sorted into the house that had produced that Dark Lord and nearly every soul who had followed him. At the Gryffindor table, Ron's mouth hung open. At the staff table, a fork stopped halfway to a mouth. And at the center, behind the half-moon glasses, in the long instant while the green and silver table remembered how to move, Albus Dumbledore's face did a thing Harry had crossed a lifetime to see it do. It faltered, only for a moment, only the width of a held breath. Then the old man was clapping, warm and unhurried, leading a scatter of applause that the rest of the hall picked up out of pure confusion, and his eyes, when they found Harry's across the tables, were exactly as blue and exactly as kind as they had always been. But Harry had seen the falter, and he knew what a falter meant on a face that had not been surprised by anything in half a century, and he took his seat among the startled snakes with the knowledge held close and warm inside him. The man who had planned every step of his first life had just watched the very first step of his second go somewhere he had not planned. He looked up at the staff table while the last children were sorted, and he found the turban. Quirrell sat between the empty chair that would be Snape's and a which Harry did not need to place, and he was talking to no one, and his eyes under the purple cloth were fixed on the Slytherin table with an attention that had nothing to do with the professor's mild interest in his new students. The scar on Harry's forehead woke. It was not the tearing agony it would later become. It was a thin hot wire, a warning, the particular signature of the thing behind the turban turning its blind, unknowing hunger in his direction, and Harry lowered his eyes to his empty plate and let the pain sit and read it the way you read a compass. Present, weak. Watching Slytherin now because the child who broke the Dark Lord had just walked into the house of Salazar and the Wraith did not know what to make of that any more than Dumbledore did. Good, let them all wonder. A board full of confused players was a board on which a man who was not confused could do very nearly anything he liked. The feast filled the golden plates and Harry ate because the body needed it and because an 11-year-old who did not eat at the welcome feast was a thing people remembered, and around him the older Slytherins conducted their careful reconnaissance of the impossible new boy in their midst. A prefect named Gemma asked smooth questions about his summer. A heavy sixth year weighed him with small eyes. Draco Malfoy, 3 seats down, kept glancing over with the wounded confusion of someone whose whole map of the world had just been folded wrong, because in Draco's map Harry Potter was the enemy, and now the enemy was wearing his colors and would sleep in his dormitory, and Draco could not decide whether he had been given a prize or a trap. Harry answered the questions with the ease of a man who had spent a lifetime being interrogated by people cleverer and crueler than a Slytherin prefect. He gave away nothing and seemed to give away everything, which was a trick, and by the time the plates cleared he had a rough map of the house's factions in his head and had said, on the record, precisely nothing that could be used against him. The green and silver banners hung over him. He was, on the first night of the second life, exactly where the enemy least expected him and best placed to watch them all. The dungeons received him into cold and greenlit stone, and the Slytherin common room lay under the lake so that the water pressed gray-green at the deep windows and pale things moved in it in the dark, and Harry did not go straight to bed among the sleeping sons of his enemies. He sat instead in a low chair by the black glass and ran the board, and after a while the board sent him company. An older student found him there, a lean fifth-year named Rosier with a prefect's badge on his robes, and a family name Harry had last heard read out at a trial he would not attend for 6 more years. He did not miss the coincidence. He let the older boy sit and he let him probe, and he answered as a clever child answers a suspicious adult, with just enough truth to be trusted and not one grain more. You confuse people, Potter, Rosier said, studying him over the water. The whole school thinks you should be scarlet and gold. Half of Slytherin thinks the hat's gone senile in its old age. The other half thinks you're a spy Dumbledore's planted in our common room. And what do you think? I think, Rosier said slowly, that a child who ends the Dark Lord in his cradle and then gets sorted here isn't any of the things they're saying. I think you're something new. I haven't decided yet whether new is dangerous. New is always dangerous, Harry said. That's rather the point of it. He let the older boy chew on that, and he did not smile, and he watched Rosier decide provisionally to stand close to the thing he could not yet measure and keep watching it, which was the only sensible response a Slytherin had to a mystery. That suited Harry to the ground. He wanted them all close and watching. A house full of the sons of Death Eaters was, to a mind that knew every name and every crime their fathers would one day commit, the finest listening post in Britain, and the Sorting Hat had just handed him a bed in the middle of it. He went up at last and lay in the four-poster and let the body remind him what it was. It wanted the whole clean, dreamless sleep of a 10-year-old, and the mind above it would not let go of the columns and the fangs and the rooster he had not yet fetched, and the two of them argued in the dark the way they argued every night now. He had learned in the 10 years to take rest as a soldier takes ammunition, in whatever quantity was going, gratefully, without illusions. He took it now. He closed the war room and let the child sleep, because the child's body was the only body he had, and a general who did not maintain his equipment lost wars he had no business losing. The first days he spent learning the terrain he already half remembered and letting the castle teach the children around him to stop staring at him. He was unremarkable in lessons on purpose, competent and quiet, a half-beat behind Hermione Granger's raised hand in every class so that no one would think to wonder how a cupboard-raised orphan already knew the theory of switching spells. He walked the corridors mapping them against the map in his skull. He found, without appearing to look for it, the second-floor girls' bathroom that no one used, and the tap with the little snake scratched into its side, and he did not so much as pause as he passed it, though everything in him wanted to. He watched the high table the way a cartographer watches a dangerous coastline. Quirrell stammered through his lessons with the wraith riding blind behind his skull, and Harry sat in the third row and gave the poor teacher exactly the attention a diligent student gives a poor teacher, and learned the rhythm of the scar's warnings until he could nearly have charted the wraith's moods on a graph. Snape watched Harry and pretended not to. And Dumbledore, from the center of the long table, watched everyone with the mild, inexhaustible patience of a man playing 40 games of chess at once and winning most of them, and Harry watched Dumbledore back, and neither of them let the other catch him at it. The conversation Harry had known would come came in a corridor on the ninth day. He was walking back from the library alone in the blue hour before dinner when the headmaster fell into step beside him with the ease of a man keeping a long-standing appointment, robes the color of a bruised plum, half-moon glasses catching the torchlight. "Mr. Potter, I confess I have been hoping for a word. It is not every year the sorting surprises me, and curiosity at my age is a rare enough pleasure that I have learned to indulge it shamelessly." "People keep telling me I'm a surprise, sir," Harry said. "I don't feel like one from the inside." "No," Dumbledore agreed, blue eyes drifting down to him, warm and attentive past the point of comfort. "One rarely does, and yet here you are in green, where I would have staked a good deal you would never go. The hat does not err, so I am left to conclude that I did not know you half so well as I believed. A humbling admission for an old man, and humbling things are said to be good for us. Are you settled in your house?" There was a hook in it somewhere, there always was. Harry looked up into the ancient kind face and gave the hook nothing to catch on. "Settled seems a strange thing to ask of a school, sir, but I'm where I ought to be, I'm sure of that much." He let a beat pass the length of a chess clock. "Aren't you?" Something moved far back in the blue eyes, a flicker quickly folded away, and Dumbledore inclined his silver head as though the child had said something worth the noting down. "Sure," he murmured. "What a splendid thing it must be to be 11 years old and sure of anything." He laid a light hand on Harry's shoulder, dry and warm and nearly weightless, a benediction and a measurement in one, and then he went up the moving stair with his robes whispering over the stone and left Harry alone in the torchlight with a cold, clean certainty of his own. The old man had walked away knowing less than he had come for and troubled precisely by that. Snape was the one variable he handled with real care. The potions master swept into the first lesson in his usual cloud of black, cold and ready to despise, and he found Harry's name on his register and his eyes came up cold and ready, loaded with everything he had owed a dead man for 20 years and never once been able to collect. "Potter," he said, soft, into the taut silence of the first years. "Our new celebrity, in Slytherin no less. Tell me, since you clearly consider yourself above the ordinary business of preparation, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" The old Harry had not known. This one had brewed the draught of living death in a war, over a campfire, with his hands shaking from the cold and from what the war had already taken out of them. "You get the draught of living death, sir," Harry said evenly, and did not smirk and did not preen, and gave the answer the flat competence of a fact rather than a challenge. "Asphodel and wormwood, bezoars for most poisons, you'd find one in the stomach of a goat, and monkshood and wolfsbane are the same plant, aconite, so it isn't much of a question." He let a beat pass. "My mother was good at potions, I thought I'd try to be." The last was a knife, and he slid it in without heat, and he watched it land. Snape's face closed like a fist. Lily's name in her son's mouth in Slytherin's dungeon, offered not as a taunt but as a quiet claim on the one soft thing in the man, was a move Snape had no counter for, because to sneer at it would be to sneer at her. He took 5 points from no one and set the class to brewing and did not look at Harry again for the length of the lesson. And Harry brewed a flawless bowl cure and understood that he had, in 90 seconds, converted the most dangerous teacher in the castle from a certain enemy into a man who did not know what he was, and a man who did not know what you were was a man who moved carefully. By the second week he was ready to go beneath the school. He had watched and he had waited, and he had acquired the one thing the plan needed that the castle could not simply hand him. Hagrid kept roosters behind his hut, a dozen fat red birds whose crowing woke the forest edge each dawn, and Hagrid, who could refuse Harry nothing and questioned him about even less, put the kettle on at the sight of him and sent the polite young Slytherin home with a squawking bird under his arm when Harry said, truthfully, that he wanted to try drawing it. He drew it badly in Hagrid's hut over rock cakes, and he asked to keep it a day or two, and Hagrid waved him off with the bird and a slab of fruitcake and no suspicion in the whole enormous kindness of him. Harry knew what a basilisk was and knew the 4 things that could undo one. Its gaze killed outright when I met eye, and killed slower, froze you into stone when the gaze came bent through water or glass or a ghost's transparent body. Spiders fled before it. And a rooster's crow, the plain barnyard morning cry of a common cockerel, was death to it, sure and absolute, the one homely small thing in all the world that the king of serpents could not survive to hear. He went down on a Saturday night when the castle slept, the rooster silenced under a charm in a covered cage, his eyes his chief problem and his chief plan. The bathroom was cold and dripping and long abandoned. The mirrors furred with grime, and the ghost of the girl who had died there rose out of a cubicle to complain and then went quiet when Harry spoke to her gently and told her he was sorry for what had been done to her and meant it. He asked Myrtle to keep to her pipes for an hour and trouble no one, and she, who was troubled by everyone and listened to by no one, drifted away almost shy at being asked. Then Harry stood before the ring of taps and found the one with the serpent scratched into its copper, and he opened his mouth and he let the language come. It came the way it always came, from the fragment behind his scar, from the sliver of a murderer's soul lodged in him since he was 1 year old, and he hated the source of it and used it without hesitation, because a weapon did not become less useful for having been stolen from your enemy. "Open," he said, and it left his mouth not as a word but as a low liquid hiss, sibilant. wet, a sound no human throat should make, and the tap glowed white and began to turn, and the whole wall of basins slid apart and sank away, and a pipe wide enough to swallow a grown man yawned open in the floor, breathing up cold air that smelled of 1,000 years of dark and old water, and something underneath the water that was rank and reptilian and alive. He went down into it with the cage strapped to his back and a conjured light held low, and the pipe carried him down and down through the roots of the castle and out at last onto a floor of wet stone scattered with the small bones of 1,000 years of rats, and he lit the dark, and the dark went on. The chamber of secrets opened before him like the nave of a drowned cathedral. It ran away into blackness on either hand, a hall of vast wet columns carved into the likeness of coiled serpents, their stone scales green with a millennium of damp, their stone eyes catching his light and throwing it back in points of dead fire. Water lay in black sheets across the floor and doubled the columns downward into a second sunken hall of reflections. At the far end, where his light could barely reach, a face rose out of the stone to the roof, the colossal graven face of Salazar Slytherin, ancient and simian and severe, its stone beard falling to the floor, its stone mouth shut on the thing that slept behind it, the scale of it pressed down on him. He was 3 feet of orphan and a school jumper standing in the throat of the oldest secret in Britain, and the part of him that was still a child wanted very badly to run, and the part of him that had commanded the dead did not let it. He made himself breathe the rank cold air and take the measure of the place, because measurement was the antidote to the animal wish to run, and he had spent a lifetime learning to measure a thing instead of drowning in it. The columns marched away into a dark his light could not end. Somewhere in that dark the thing was waking. He felt the black water tremble with the first stirrings of a body the size of a fallen oak. 1,000 years it had lain here. Slytherin had raised it before there was an England worth the name, before the castle overhead wore any of its present towers, and it had outlived every heir who woke it and every child it had killed, and it did not know, could not conceive, that its ending had come down the pipe tonight in the shape of a boy who barely reached the shin of the graven founder and carried a chicken in a covered box. That was the whole secret of the world, laid bare in a drowned cathedral. Power had never really been a question of size. The war had taught him that in letters of blood. The larger army lost to the better plan, the older monster fell to the homelier trick. The greatest wizard of the age was undone in the end by the plainest magic there was, the kind a mother works without a wand, which he had never once troubled to reckon with. Harry was 3 feet tall, and he was going to kill the king of serpents, and he was going to do it not with a sword he did not own or a courage he could not spare, but with a barnyard cockerel and a closed pair of eyes, because he had learned dying to want the win and not the glory of it, and the win was a homely, unlovely certain thing that fit inside a birdcage. He set the cage down where he could reach it, and he did not open it yet, and he lifted his face to the stone mouth of the founder, and he spoke the words that Tom Riddle had spoken to loose the monster on the school, because the monster answered to the tongue of serpents, and Harry had that tongue whether he had earned it or not. "Speak to me, Slytherin, greatest of the Hogwarts Four." For a long moment nothing, the water dripped. Then the stone mouth ground open on a darkness deeper than the chambers, and out of the throat of Salazar Slytherin came the king of serpents, and it came the way a river comes over a fall, endless, a column of dark green muscle thicker than a man was tall, pouring out and out onto the wet floor with a hiss that filled the whole vast hall like weather, and Harry shut his eyes. He had known he would have to. The gaze killed, and he could not fight what he could not look at, and so he had come down into the dark to fight blind, with his eyes closed against a monster 50 feet long that could smell his heat and taste him on the air with a flickering tongue longer than his arm. He stood in the black behind his own eyelids, and he heard the wet, enormous slither of it circling, and he spoke to it in the only language it had heard in 1,000 years. "You have slept a long time," Harry hissed, and turned his blind face to follow the sound of it. "A long time in the dark, waiting for a master to wake you and give you leave to feed. I am not your master, I have no drop of Slytherin's blood in me, but I have his tongue, and I have come down alone into your house, and I would speak with you before the end." The great voice that answered him was old past reckoning and slow, a grinding subterranean sibilance that he felt in the water at his feet before he understood it as words. "Speaker," it said, "small speaker, warm and small and not of the blood, I smell the master on you, I smell Achim on you, the last one, the one who woke me and fed me and left me to sleep. You carry a piece of him behind your eyes, are you his get? Has he sent you?" "He has sent me nothing," Harry said. "He does not know I exist. The piece of him I carry against my will, and I mean to burn it out along with all the rest of him." Behind his closed eyes he mapped the hall from memory and from sound, the columns, the water, the sunken second hall of reflections, the cage at his feet. "You have been used, serpent. 1,000 years Slytherin's heirs woke you to murder children in these halls and sent you back to the dark when they were done. And the last of them, the one whose scent is on me, used you worst of all and would use you again if he could put on a body to command you. I will not free you because you are a weapon too terrible to leave in the world, and I will not leave you sleeping because he will come for you in the end, but I will not lie to you about it. That is more than any master ever gave you." The serpent laughed, if a sound that ancient and that cold could be called a laugh, a long dry hiss that stirred the black water. "Honest little warm thing, you think to fight me, you cannot even open your eyes. One look, speaker, one look into your stone, and I will keep you here among the columns for another 1,000 years, a little gray statue in my hall, and no one will ever come." It was moving as it spoke, circling closer, and Harry tracked it by the displacement of the water and the reek of it and turned always to keep his blind face toward the sound, and his hand found the latch of the cage. "You're right," Harry said. "I can't beat you looking, so I won't look." He crouched, still turning, the vast wet weight of the thing swinging round toward the sound of his voice, close now, close enough that its breath moved his hair, close enough that when it struck, the strike would not miss. "I told you the truth about everything else, Serpent. Here is the last of it. I did not come down here to duel the King of Serpents. I came down here to win, and winning has nothing to do with looking you in the eye." He threw the latch. The rooster erupted out of the cage into the vast dark in a blur of feathers and beating wings. And Harry, blind, flat against the wet stone with the columns of Salazar Slytherin rising over him and the monster's shadow filling the hall he could not see, spoke one word to the bird in the plain speech of men, the only spell that mattered, an old charm to loose a held sound and release the silence he had bound around its throat. The rooster crowed. It was the most ordinary sound in the world, a barnyard cry, thin and cracked and absurd in that drowned cathedral of 1,000 years of murder, and it went through the chamber of secrets like the blade of God. The basilisk screamed. Harry had never heard anything scream like that and never wished to again. A sound with the whole outrage of 1,000 years in it, the King of Serpents undone by a farmyard bird, and the enormous body convulsed and thrashed and brought down a column in a roar of shattering stone and threw black water to the roof. And Harry stayed low with his arms over his head and his eyes shut and let the world come apart above him and did not look, did not look, did not look. Until the thrashing slowed and the screaming choked to a wet rattle and the enormous coils went still in the dark, and the last thing the King of Serpents did in 1,000 years was die to the sound of a rooster, exactly as the plain, honest arithmetic of the world had always promised it would. Harry opened his eyes. The basilisk lay dead in ruin across half the chamber, a green mountain of it, its head the size of a horse, its mouth fallen open on fangs each the length of Harry's forearm, curved and yellowed and beaded already at the tips, with the venom that did not die when the snake did. He stood over it in the wreck of the columns with the rooster clucking and strutting on a fallen block, obscene and triumphant. And he looked at the thing he had killed, a monster older than the school, older than the country's magic, dead at the hand of a child who had planned it 3 ways from a cupboard in Surrey, and he allowed himself, for the length of one breath in that ringing silence, the single naked thing he would allow himself all night. Oh, not at the serpent. At the shape of the thing he had just proven. The body was 3 feet of 11-year-old and the mind was a war. And tonight the two had been enough together to walk into the deepest and oldest dark in Britain and come out with the one weapon in the country that could kill a piece of a soul. Everything after this was arithmetic. He had just made the impossible part look easy, and he stood in the ruin and let the enormity of it move through him once, and then he put it down where he put everything down and went to work. He worked the rest of the night with the cold efficiency the war had taught him. He drew 2 of the great fangs free of the dead jaw with a wrench and a wet crack, wrapped them in oilcloth and stowed them where his hands could reach them. He drew off venom into the flask he had brought, careful of his skin, because the stuff that could unmake a Horcrux could unmake a boy just as fast. He took what he could carry and left the mountain of the rest in the dark for later, because a whole basilisk was a fortune in potion stock and armor-grade hide, and he was not a person, now or ever again, who left a fortune lying on a floor. He sent the rooster up the pipe ahead of him in its cage. He hissed the chamber shut behind him and left the drowned cathedral to its silence and its one great corpse. He came up into the abandoned bathroom in the gray before dawn, soaked to the skin and reeking of the deep, with 2 basilisk fangs and a flask of the deadliest venom in the world wrapped against his ribs, and he stood a moment among the grimy sinks and let his breathing slow. 6 anchors. He now held at 11 years old in the 2nd week of the second life, the means to destroy every one of them, harvested from a monster he had killed with a farmyard bird and a lifetime's foreknowledge. And not one soul in the castle above him knew that the deepest secret of Hogwarts had just been opened, emptied, and closed again by the quiet young Slytherin who would be in the great hall for breakfast in 3 hours, as though nothing at all had changed. The diary first, he thought, drying his hair with a conjured warmth and turning for the dungeons. Malfoy holds it and does not know what it is. Then the ring in the valley under the floor. He went down through the sleeping castle with the venom against his heart and the whole map of the war laid out and lit inside him. And above him the towers caught the first gray of the morning, and somewhere behind a purple turban a wraith turned over in its stolen sleep and dreamed uneasily of a stone it would never reach and a boy it would never see coming. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, the ledger of the dead the venom would keep, the man and the rat would not. Harry lay awake the night after the chamber and turned the order of operations over the way a jeweler turns a stone, looking for the facet that caught the most light. He had 6 anchors to unmake and a wraith to starve and a ministry to bend, and the temptation, the child's temptation, was to run at the biggest target first, to charge the darkest door. He had learned better in a war. You did not open with your strongest move. You opened with the move that unlocked the most other moves, the one that turned a single piece into a hinge on which the whole board swung. That move was a rat. Peter Pettigrew, asleep in a Gryffindor dormitory in the body of Ronald Weasley's pet, was worth more to Harry alive and exposed than any anchor he could burn. Destroy him quietly and Harry gained a dead traitor and nothing else. Produce him whole and confessing before the right eyes and 3 things fell at once. Sirius Black, Godfather Marauder, the one adult in Britain who had been James Potter's brother in all but blood and asked nothing for it, walked out of Azkaban a free man and owing Harry a debt that could not be measured. The ministry that had thrown Sirius into a cell without a trial was humiliated on the front page of its own newspaper. And Albus Dumbledore, who had sat on the Wisengamot and let his old friend rot rather than complicate a plan, was revealed quietly to anyone paying attention as a man who had known and done nothing. Harry intended to pay attention. He intended, in fact, to be the only person in Britain who understood exactly what had just happened, while appearing to be a first-year who had happened to be at school when it did. The first problem was the rat itself. Pettigrew was a coward, and cowards had the finest survival instincts in the world. The instant he sensed a net closing, he would bolt down a drain and vanish into the country, and there would be no second chance for a decade. Harry could not have that. So he began, in the ordinary way of a friendly housemate, to spend a little time near Ron Weasley in the library and the courtyards, and in the course of that time he got, once, close enough to the sleeping gray rat to touch it, and while he scratched its ragged head and Ron complained about its laziness. Harry breathed 3 words over it that no first-year should have known, and laid on Peter Pettigrew a binding so fine and so deep that the man would not feel it until he tried to become a man again and found he could not become anything else. It was old magic, and it cost him. The child body was not built to carry a spell of that weight, and he paid for it in a night of fever he hid from the matron and the dormitory both, sweating out the backlash alone behind his bed curtains with a silencing charm around him and his teeth clenched on a strip of leather. By morning it had passed. The rat was sealed into its shape, a lock without a key, and it did not know it, and Harry ate his porridge in the great hall and watched Ron carry the doomed thing to breakfast in his pocket and let nothing of it reach his face. The cost of that binding taught him a lesson he wrote in large letters across the whole plan. The mind knew 100 spells the body could not yet safely cast, and every time he reached past the body's limit he paid in fever, in tremor, in a day of gray exhaustion he had to hide behind a schoolboy's ordinary tiredness. He could not simply outmagic his problems the way a grown wizard would. The equipment would not bear it, so he would outthink them instead. He would spend cunning where a man would spend power, and preparation where a man would spend nerve, and other people's hands wherever his own were too small, and he would save the body's little reserve of raw magic for the 2 or 3 moments in the whole campaign when nothing but his own wand in his own hand would do. That was the discipline of the second life, and the rat had just charged him a night of fever to learn it, and it was cheap at the price. The one variable he could not command was Amelia Bones, and he had made his peace with that the way a soldier makes peace with weather. He had given her a truth too specific to ignore and too checkable to bury, delivered by a courier no one could lean on, and if she was the woman he remembered she would move on it within the week and move hard. If she was not, he would learn something useful about how far the rot in the ministry ran, and he would find another road, because there was always another road. He had built the plan so that even failure taught him the map. Then he waited and ate his porridge and let the school think him ordinary, and the woman did not disappoint him. The second problem was delivery, and here he did not intend to touch the thing at all. He wrote the dossier over 3 careful evenings in a hand that was not his own, a flat clerk's copperplate he had practiced until it held no trace of a child, and he told the truth in it the way you tell the truth when you want it believed, without heat, in checkable pieces, each fact a stone the reader could pick up and weigh. He wrote that Sirius Black had never been the Potter's secret keeper, that the charm had been switched at the last hour to Peter Pettigrew, that Pettigrew had betrayed the Potters, murdered 13 muggles in a single curse to fake his own death, cut off a finger to sell the story, and fled in his unregistered animagus form as a common rat. He wrote where the rat could be found. He wrote that it would be missing a toe on one front foot, the toe that matched the finger buried with full honors in an empty grave. He wrote that a forced reversal cast upon it would produce a man, and that man under a drop of Veritaserum would end a decade of an innocent man's imprisonment in an afternoon. He signed it with nothing. Then he sent it not to the ministry, which leaked, and not to Dumbledore, who managed, but to Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a woman he remembered as one of the few in that whole rotten building who had never in her life been anyone's creature. And he sent it through the one courier in Britain no one questioned and no one could trace, because he had opened a line to them on his 11th birthday and paid in advance for exactly this kind of discretion. A Gringotts clerk delivered the sealed packet to Madame Bones's private office by goblin hand, and a goblin's hand carried no fingerprints a wizard could read, and the goblins, asked later, would say only that a client's instructions were a client's business, and the bank did not discuss its clients, which was the truest and most useful sentence in the English language. He had done all he could do. The rest belonged to a woman he was betting his godfather's life on, and he had learned in the war to make that kind of bet on the strength of who a person was rather than what they promised, and he had never once known Amelia Bones to leave a checkable fact unchecked. She came to Hogwarts 4 days later. He knew the moment the machinery moved, because the castle changed its weather the way a house changes when strangers with authority walk into it. At breakfast on the Thursday there were 2 Aurors standing at the doors of the great hall who had not been there the day before, red-robed, unhurried, watching the Gryffindor table, And at the high table, Dumbledore's usual serene attention had a new quality to it, a stillness, the stillness of a man who has been informed of something he was not consulted about and is deciding, very fast and behind a calm face, how much it will cost him. Amelia Bones herself sat at his right hand where a guest of the ministry sat, square-jawed and monocled and entirely unimpressed by the golden ceiling, and she was watching Ronald Weasley's pocket. Harry ate his toast and did not look at any of it directly and missed nothing. It happened between the eggs and the post owls. Bones rose, and the two Aurors moved down the Gryffindor table with the smooth economy of people who had done this 100 times, and there was a ripple of alarm and craning necks, and Ron half stood with his mouth full and his ears scarlet as a red-robed woman asked him, courteously and without any room in it at all, to hand over his rat. Scabbers, sensing at last the thing Harry had sealed him against, tried to run. He came out of Ron's pocket in a gray streak and hit the flagstones and shot for the gap under the doors, and an Auror said a word, and the rat tumbled skidding into the light, and Amelia Bones lifted her wand and spoke the reversal in a voice that carried to every corner of the silent hall. The rat screamed and stretched and stood up into a man. He was exactly as Harry remembered, and worse for being real again. Short, balding, gray-skinned, with watery eyes and a pointed nose, and the trembling, boneless hands of a creature that had spent a decade being small, and one of those hands was missing a finger. He stood in the middle of the great hall in his stolen years with 400 children staring, and Peter Pettigrew, who had sold Lily and James Potter to their killer and let another man take the blame, looked wildly around for a hole to run down and found the whole world watching and began in a high-cracked whimper to plead before anyone had even asked him a question, which was the only confession an intelligent woman needed, and Amelia Bones was an intelligent woman. "Peter Pettigrew," she said into the ringing quiet, and the name went through the hall like cold water. "Order of Merlin, first class, buried these 10 years, how very well you look." They took him in chains, and they took his testimony under veritas from that same day in a locked room, and the truth serum did what Harry had counted on it to do, and rather more besides. Pettigrew, emptied of all his careful lies, gave them not only his own crimes but the shape of a network he had once belonged to, names of men who had bought their freedom with gold and a story after the last war and gone back to their manors and their ministry posts to wait. Harry had not asked for that. He had asked only for a freed godfather. But a wise general took the ground the enemy handed him, whether he had planned to hold it or not, and every name the little gray man coughed up under the serum was a name Harry now knew the ministry knew, and knowing what your enemies knew about each other was its own kind of wealth. By the weekend, the Daily Prophet had done the rest. PTTIGRW alive, black innocent, screamed the front page over a photograph of the shaking little man, and beneath it, in a smaller and far more dangerous type, the questions began. How had a wanted man lived 12 years as a schoolboy's pet under the ministry's nose? Why had Sirius Black never received a trial? Who had signed the order that sent him to Azkaban without one? The last question had an answer, and the answer was a name on a decade-old committee, and the name was not one the prophet quite dared to print, but it was there in the white space for anyone who could read a silence. Harry read it and understood the shape of what he had just done to the board. He had not merely freed a godfather. He had reached into the sealed machinery of the ministry and demonstrated to everyone who mattered that its most confident judgments could be wrong, that a man could be condemned by the whole apparatus of justice and be innocent all along, and that the apparatus had never once bothered to check. A country that had just watched that happen was a country ready, without knowing it, to have a great many other confident judgments questioned in the years to come, and Harry meant to be the one holding the questions. Every institution had a keystone of certainty, and the whole vaulted weight of it rested on the belief that the institution did not make mistakes of this kind. Pettigrew was the crack Harry had driven into that keystone, and cracks, once started in the right stone, ran on their own. Harry read the silence over his pumpkin juice and let no part of what moved in him reach his face. At the high table, Albus Dumbledore congratulated Madame Bones on a fine piece of work and meant. Harry was certain, every gracious word of it, and was also behind the blue eyes running very fast down a corridor of consequences, because a hinge had turned in his careful world and he had not been the one to turn it, and he did not yet know who had. The fallout ran through the school for a week like a change in the weather, and Harry moved through it a half step behind the crowd, exactly as visible and exactly as ordinary as a first year should be. Ron took it hardest, which Harry had known he would, because a child does not easily learn that the small warm creature he has fed and carried since he was 6 years old was a grown murderer wearing a disguise and sleeping on his pillow. Harry found him on the second evening on the covered bridge, alone, his freckled face blotched and thunderous, throwing bits of gravel at the drop and not caring who saw. Harry did not make him talk. He simply came and stood at the rail beside him and threw a few stones of his own into the dark. And after a while Ron said thickly that his whole family had touched that thing, that Ginny used to let it sleep in her doll's house, that Percy had let it ride on his shoulder for 3 years. And what if it had done something? What if it had been waiting for a chance to do something? And Harry, who knew precisely what it had been waiting to do, and to whom said only that it was over now. That the thing was in a cell where it belonged, that Ron's family had been braver and luckier than they knew, and there was no shame in not seeing a snake until it showed its fangs. It was true, all of it, and it was also the exact medicine the situation required, and Ron went in to dinner a little straighter for it, and never once wondered why the strange Slytherin boy always seemed to know the right thing to say. That was the shape of it in those days. Harry gave true comfort and drew true gratitude and let both of them do the quiet work of building him, in the mind of everyone who mattered, into the last thing anyone would suspect, a kind and unremarkable child. Slytherin took the news differently, and watching Slytherin take it was worth more to Harry than any front page. Draco Malfoy went gray when he understood that a fugitive Death Eater's associate had been living in a blood trader's house for a decade under the Ministry's nose, because Draco's whole cosmology depended on his side being the clever one, and a story in which the Ministry, the Weasleys, and the great Dumbledore had all been made fools of by a single anonymous letter was a story with no comfortable place for a Malfoy to stand. He said something spiteful about black at breakfast testing, and when no one at the Slytherin table agreed with him quite fast enough, he let it drop, and Harry watched him learn in real time that the ground had shifted under his family and he could not yet see how far. Later, Draco drifted near Harry in the common room, not to speak, only to be near the one person in the house who seemed unbothered by any of it, and Harry let him hover and said nothing, and added Draco's uncertainty to a ledger that was filling up nicely. He kept all that week, one eye on a danger that had nothing to do with the Ministry. Somewhere in a cold manor a black book sat in a false drawer, and its owner did not yet know it was gone, and the day Lucius Malfoy opened that drawer and found it empty was a day Harry needed to have already passed. The clock on the diary was quiet for now. He did not intend to let it run long. Sirius Black came out of Azkaban 11 days after that. Harry had arranged, through the same goblin channel and a great deal of the same discretion, that he would be permitted to meet his newly cleared godfather, because it was the natural thing for an orphan to want, and because Harry never wasted a natural thing when it could be made to carry an unnatural one. They gave him an hour in a bare Ministry visiting room with a plain table and a witch pretending not to listen by the door, and then the door opened and the man came in, and Harry stood up to meet the second ghost of the second life. Sirius was thin the way a man is thin when the Dementors have had him, gray at the temples at 32, his handsome face fallen in on its own bones, his eyes too bright in their hollows. But there was a wildness in him that Azkaban had bent and not broken, and when he saw Harry he stopped in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment, at the black hair and the shape of the face and the eyes, and something in the ruined man's expression came apart and put itself back together wrong into the beginnings of a life he had stopped letting himself believe in. "You look just like him," Sirius said hoarse. Except the eyes," Harry said. "I know, people tell me." He gestured at the second chair, and he made his voice gentle because for once the gentleness cost him nothing and served him besides. "Sit down, Sirius, before you fall down. We haven't got long and there are things I want to say to you while it's just us." Sirius sat because his legs were unsteady and because the child was giving orders in James Potter's voice, and Harry looked at his godfather across the plain table and made the first real alliance of the second life with a truth wrapped around a hook, exactly as he had made every other move, except that this hook was also underneath, the nearest thing to honest he had let himself be with a living soul. "I got you out," Harry said quietly. "Not the Ministry, not Dumbledore, me. I found out Pettigrew was alive, I found out how to prove it, and I put the proof where it couldn't be buried. You don't have to believe an 11-year-old did that. I'd rather you didn't say it to anyone at all, but I need you to know it because I need you to understand what I'm asking when I ask you to trust me over the men who left you in that cell for 12 years. Sirius stared at him. Whatever he had braced for, it was not this, not a small solemn child in Slytherin green telling him, without a shred of the wildness that would have made it easy to dismiss, that he had engineered a national scandal from a school desk. And the terrible thing, the thing Harry watched land, was that Sirius believed him, because Sirius had spent 12 years with nothing to do but learn the taste of the truth, and this had the taste. "Slytherin," Sirius said at last, faintly, seizing on the one thing small enough to hold. "James is going to come back from the dead just to have a word with the Sorting Hat." "James would understand it if he were here," Harry said. "You will too in time. I'm not the child everyone's expecting me to be." "Sirius, I can't tell you why, not yet, maybe not ever. But I'm going to end the thing that killed my parents before it can rise again, and I have most of it planned, and I did not free you out of sentiment alone." He held the gray wild gaze. "I freed you because you're the only person left alive who will stand at my back and ask no questions I can't answer. Will you?" Sirius Black, who had buried one Potter and now found himself, past all sense, unwilling to lose a second, looked at his godson for a long time, and then he laughed, a cracked, broken, rusty sound with something whole underneath it, and he reached across the plain table and gripped the child's small hand in his ruined one. "Merlin helped the both of us," he said. "Yes." Harry gave him the terms while the witch by the door pretended to read her clipboard, and he gave them the way a commander gives an order to a soldier he means to keep alive, plainly, in the right sequence, nothing wasted. First, Sirius would file for guardianship of his godson, which the law allowed and no court would now refuse a cleared and wronged man, and which would in one stroke pull Harry out of privet drive forever and hand him something he had never had in either life. An adult of his own, unbeholden to Dumbledore, who could travel where a schoolboy could not and hold what a schoolboy could not hold and open doors that stayed shut to the young. Second, Sirius would be seen to do nothing remarkable. He would recover in public, forgive the ministry in public, be photographed being gracious, and let the whole world file him away as a broken man rebuilding a quiet life. Because a broken man rebuilding a quiet life was invisible, and invisibility was the most valuable thing Harry could give him. Third, Harry said, "You will want very badly to go and find the men who did this to us and make them pay for it, and you will not, because that is exactly what everyone who fears us is waiting for you to do." Sirius's jaw worked. There it was, the wildness, the thing that had made him charge a street full of muggles after a laughing rat and land himself in a cell for 12 years. "You can't ask me to sit still," he said low. "Not now, not when I know. I'm not asking you to sit still. I'm asking you to move when I tell you and where I tell you, which is a different thing and a harder one and the only one that works." Harry leaned in over the plain table, and he let the old man see for one unguarded moment the general behind the child's face. "There's a house you own that's been shut for 10 years. Number 12, Grimmauld Place. There's an elf in it who served your brother, and there's a thing in it your brother died stealing, a locket black and heavy that has to be destroyed and can only be destroyed by me, and there are other things like it in other places, and I am going to find every one of them and end them, and then I am going to end the man who made them, and I will have done it before he ever draws a proper breath again. That is the war, Sirius. It is already half won and no one knows it's being fought. I need a free man to be my hands in the daylight world while I finish it. I do not need a martyr. Give me the first and I promise you the second will never be necessary." Sirius Black looked at his godson across the bare table in the gray ministry light, and whatever he had walked into that room expecting to find, a lost orphan, a stranger, a memory of James in miniature, he did not find it, and the not finding of it settled something in him that Azkaban had left loose. He nodded once slowly, a soldier taking a commission from an officer he had decided, against every instinct of age and blood, to trust. "You'll tell me what you can when you can," he said. "I'll tell you what keeps you useful and alive," Harry said. "That's more than anyone's told either of us in a long time." That was the hinge turned all the way, and the door it opened was wide. The guardianship went through inside a fortnight, unopposed, a cleared man's natural claim on his murdered friend's son, and with a stroke of a ministry quill the cupboard under the stairs closed behind Harry forever. He would spend the school holidays in a wizarding house now in his godfather's care, with a wizarding guardian's signature on the forms that let a boy leave the castle grounds for family reasons. He noted the change as he noted every acquisition by its uses. It gave him an address the owls of the world would answer to. It gave him an adult whose name opened the doors of Diagon Alley and the offices of the ministry. And it gave the 10-year-old buried under the war one thing the general did not strictly need and took anyway, because even a general is allowed a little: a door in a house somewhere that would never again be locked from the outside. With Sirius came a house in London that had been shut and silent for a decade, and in that house a portrait that screamed in a cellar of dark inheritance, and most of all a house elf. But the elf at Grimmauld Place was Harry's task for another week, and there was a nearer anchor to burn first, and the burning of it needed a different servant of a different house, one who wanted, more than anything in the world, to be asked. Harry sent the letter to Malfoy Manor by owl in the same disguised hand, addressed to no wizard at all. To Dobby it said, of the House of Malfoy, "I know what your masters keep and I know how they keep you, and I mean to change the second thing on my own account when the hour is right. In the meantime I have need of your hands and your courage, both of which I judge to be greater than anyone in that cold house has ever bothered to notice. There is a book in your master's possession, small and black, a diary with a name worked into the cover, kept apart and warded because it is more dangerous than your master understands. Bring it to me at Hogwarts and tell no one, and you will have struck the first blow of your own freedom, and I do not forget a debt." He signed it, this once, with a single letter that a desperate elf who had spent years worshipping a legend would know at a glance. H. Dobby came out of the air beside Harry's bed 2 nights later with the diary clutched to his thin chest, and his tennis ball eyes enormous and streaming. And he was so overcome at being addressed, at being needed, at being trusted by the great Harry Potter, that Harry had to spend the first 5 minutes simply keeping the creature from dashing his own head against the bedpost in a fit of unworthiness. When at last Dobby was calm enough to speak, he pressed the small black book into Harry's hands as though he were handing over his own heart, and he whispered that his master kept it in a false drawer and would not miss it for weeks, and that Dobby had wanted, oh, Dobby had wanted for so long to do something, anything, against the cold, cruel house, and now the greatest wizard in the world had asked him Dobby by name. "You've done more than you know," Harry told him, and meant it, and made the elf a promise he intended to keep because kept promises were the cheapest and strongest currency there was. That when the season turned, Harry would see him free, and until then Dobby was to keep his ears open in his master's house and his mouth shut everywhere else. The elf wept and swore it and vanished, and Harry was left alone in the green dark of the Slytherin dormitory holding a Horcrux. He waited until the castle slept, and he took the diary and a basilisk fang down to the one place in Hogwarts where no one would ever come looking, the drowned chamber and its one great corpse, because a thing of this darkness deserved to die where the monster had died, and because Harry had a soldier's respect for a killing ground. He laid the diary open on the wet stone in the light of the founder's graven face, and Tom Riddle's 16-year-old memory, sensing a mind near it and a chance to feed, rose up off the blank pages in a column of black smoke and cold, and it took for a moment the half-formed shape of a handsome boy with hungry eyes, a boy Harry had watched grow into the thing behind the turban, a boy who had not yet learned he could lose. The smoke boy looked at Harry with dawning outrage, opening its mouth to charm, to threaten, to reach into the child and drink him the way it had once drunk a little red-haired girl in another life that would now never happen. "You are not Ginevra Weasley," the smoke boy said, and its voice was cultured and cold and terribly young, the voice of a head boy who had never been refused anything. "You are a stranger, and you have opened me in the Founder's own chamber, and you look at me the way a man looks at a thing he already owns. Who are you that you come down here alone into the deepest secret of Salazar Slytherin? Do you even know what I am?" "I know exactly what you are," Harry said, and did not step closer and did not raise the fang yet, because there was one thing worth saying to a shard of the enemy's soul before ending it, and only one. "You're the first mistake he ever made. You're the piece he tore off when he thought he was becoming a god, the one he prized so highly he gave it away to a servant. He doesn't even remember your name is on your own cover. He'd tell you were the future, and the truth is he forgot you existed inside a year." He watched the handsome smokeface flinch at that, the way only Tom Riddle could flinch at the suggestion of being ordinary, of being forgotten, of being less than singular. That's the whole of him in the end. Vanity that couldn't imagine being known. "And I know all of you, every drawer, every cave, every cup. I'm not here to bargain with a diary, Tom. I'm here to close the ledger." The smoke boy's outrage curdled into something Harry had never seen on any version of that face, a flicker of the animal that had always lived under all that polished poise, and it drew breath to scream for its maker across whatever black distance still joined them. Harry did not give it the sentence. He drove the basilisk fang through the heart of the diary with the whole weight of his small body behind it. Once clean, the way you kill a thing you respect enough not to toy with. The chamber screamed. Ink burst out of the ruptured pages in gouts of black that steamed where they struck the stone, and the smoke boy came apart in the middle of a word, its handsome face stretching into a howl of pure animal denial, unmaking upward into the dark, a soul shard that had believed itself immortal, learning otherwise in the space of a single ruined breath. The venom did its patient work through the parchment. The diary blackened and curled and lay still, an ordinary dead book with a hole burned through its heart, and the cold went out of the air, and the chamber was only a chamber again, drowned and silent, holding two corpses now instead of one. Harry crouched over the wreckage in the Founder's stone shadow and breathed and let himself feel for one measured moment the clean hard satisfaction of a thing done right the first time. One anchor gone. The lightest of them, the diary, the arrogant gift to servant, the Horcrux the maker had valued so little he had handed it to Lucius Malfoy as one hands a footman a coat, and in that carelessness Harry read the whole shape of the enemy's fatal flaw. Voldemort could not conceive of anyone knowing what he had done. The Horcruxes were safe not because they were well hidden, though some were, but because the very idea of them was a secret the Maker believed he alone in all history had ever discovered. He had built his immortality on the certainty that no one else knew the trick. And Harry knew the trick, knew every hiding place, knew the Maker's mind better than the Maker knew it himself, and that single asymmetry of information was worth more than any wand. He sat on his heels in the Founder's stone shadow and let the map redraw itself, 5 anchors now instead of 6, and read the roads between them as he had once read a war. The ring in the valley was the next clean target, cursed but stationary, guarded by nothing worse than a dead family's malice and one enchantment he already knew never to touch. Sirius would give him the daylight cover to reach it. The locket waited in a London house that was now, by law, his godfather's, guarded by an elf whose loyalty could be bought with the one thing no one had ever offered creature, which was the truth. The diadem sat in a room in this very castle that would open at a wish, and he could take it any night he chose. Only the cup was hard, sunk deep under the bank behind dragons and goblin law, and even the cup was not truly hard, only expensive, and Harry had spent his 11th birthday making sure he would never again be poor. 5 roads, and he could see the end of every one of them, and at the end of the last road, stripped of every anchor, was a wraith that would learn what Harry had learned in a ruined hall with the roof gone, that there is a bottom to the tide, and it takes everyone in the end, even the ones who tore themselves to pieces to cheat it. He would send the Maker there personally. But the Maker was the final move, and a general who reached for the final move before the board was set lost the game to his own impatience, and Harry had lost exactly one game in his life and did not intend to lose the rematch. First the anchors, one at a time, quietly, in the right order. He gathered the dead diary into his bag and rose. He climbed back up through the sleeping castle before dawn with the dead diary in his bag, and he was 3 flights from the dungeons when he found the corridor was not empty. Albus Dumbledore stood at the foot of the moving stair in a dressing gown the color of old wine, a candle burning in a holder in his hand, though the man had never in his life needed a candle to see in the dark, and he was waiting, and it was plain from the mild, ancient patience of his face that he had been waiting a while. "Mr. Potter," he said, "you keep unusual hours for a boy of 11. So do you, sir, for a man of 110, Harry said, and did not slow his approach and did not clutch the bag because a guilty child clutched and an innocent one did not. "I couldn't sleep, the dungeons get cold, I find walking helps. Do you?" The blue eyes rested on him, and behind them the great slow engine turned, weighing, sifting, and Harry felt the faint feather touch at the edges of his mind that meant the old man was reading the surface of him gently, deniably, and he let the old disciplines close and gave the touch nothing but a tired, cold child who wanted his bed. It has been a remarkable few weeks in this castle, Dumbledore went on. A man returns from the dead. Another returns from a prison he should never have entered. The sorting produces a result that has kept me thinking longer than any in 50 years. And through all of it, at the still center of it, a boy who couldn't sleep walking the corridors alone. He tilted his silver head. I am an old man, Harry, and old men grow superstitious about coincidence. I have begun to feel that something is moving in my school, something patient and very clever, and I confess I cannot yet see the hand that moves it. Harry looked up at him in the candlelight, and for one single breath, he considered the cost and the profit of the truth and set it aside because the hour was not right and might never be. That sounds like a heavy thing to carry, sir, he said gently, and let the old man hear in it whatever he liked. I trust you'll find the hand. It must be tiring not being able to see everything for once. Something crossed the ancient face there and gone that in a younger man might have looked like doubt, and in Dumbledore was only the deeper calculation of a chess master who has just realized the board is larger than he had drawn it. He stepped aside to let the child pass. Good night, Mr. Potter, he said softly. Do sleep. Growing minds need their rest. So they say, Harry said, and went by him up the stair with the dead Horcrux swinging at his hip. He felt the old man's attention on his back the whole length of the moving stair, patient and blue and unreadable, and he did not hurry and he did not slow, and he understood, climbing, exactly what he had just done and exactly what it had cost. He had told Dumbledore a truth dressed as a taunt, that there was a hand the old man could not see, and that the hand knew it could not be seen. A lesser player would have soothed the headmaster's suspicion, smoothed it over, played the innocent so hard the innocence itself became a tell. Harry had done the opposite. He had confirmed the suspicion and made it useless in the same breath, because a Dumbledore who knew something was moving and could not name it was a Dumbledore who would spend the coming months watching shadows, second-guessing, holding his own great power in reserve against a threat he could not locate. Nothing froze a wise man in place like a danger he could not name. Harry had just handed the wisest man in Britain a threat with no shape, and a man set to guard against a shapeless thing did not strike. He waited and watched and let the board be taken from him one quiet square at a time. He reached the top of the stair and did not look back, and behind him Albus Dumbledore stood alone in the cold corridor a long while, holding a light he did not need, staring at the place where a child had been. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. The turning of servants number 12, Grimmauld Place, came into existence between numbers 11 and 13, the way a bruise comes up under skin, dark and sudden and unwelcome, and Harry walked up its worn steps beside his godfather into a house that had been holding its breath for 10 years. It was the first Christmas of the second life, and Harry had chosen to spend it here rather than at the castle, because the castle at Christmas was Dumbledore's ground and a boy who lingered there over the holiday was a boy under a microscope, and because 2 of the 5 remaining anchors sat within reach of this cold London house, one of them behind a door in the drawing room and the other in the memory of a creature Harry meant to make his own before the week was out. The hall stank of dust and dark magic and the particular sourness of a house where something had died and not been mourned. A gas lamp guttered green. Along the wall, the mounted heads of generations of house elves hung shriveled on their plaques, and at the end of the hall a moth-eaten curtain concealed the portrait Harry knew would begin to scream the moment they woke it, and Sirius moved through all of it with the flinching recoil of a man walking back into his childhood, touching nothing, his shoulders up around his ears. I burned to get out of this place, Sirius said low. Now I've walked my godson straight into it for Christmas. James would laugh himself sick. James would understand, Harry said, and set down his bag and looked around the reeking hall with the flat assessing calm of a man taking inventory of a fortress. There are things in this house worth more than your comfort, Sirius, and one of them is going to help me end the war. Give me 3 days, then we can burn the curtains if you like. That night they sat in the kitchen at the long scrubbed table with a fire Sirius coaxed unwilling out of the old grate, and Sirius drank, and watched his godson across the flames with the sidelong care of a man trying to reconcile 2 pictures that would not overlay. The child ate like a child, small bites, a body that tired early. The mind behind the eyes weighed the room like a field commander choosing where to make a stand. Sirius had spent 12 years learning to read the difference between what a face showed and what a person was, because in Azkaban that difference was the only thing left to study, and everything he read across the table unsettled him and steadied him at once. You're going to tell me one true thing tonight, Sirius said at last, turning his glass. Not the plan, I'll take the plan on trust, Merlin help me. One true thing about you so I know who I've thrown in with. Harry considered it and decided that a measured truth bought more loyalty than any comfortable lie, and that Sirius had earned a coin of the real thing. I've done this before, he said. Not this house, not this year, the whole of it. I've lived through what's coming all the way to the end, and the end was bad, Sirius. Worse than you can stand to imagine, and you can imagine a great deal. Everyone we'd have died for died in it instead, most of them badly, and I lost. And then I woke up 11 years old with all of it still in my head and a chance to do it differently. That's the true thing. I can't prove it and I won't try. But now you know why an 11-year-old freed you from Azkaban with a letter, and why I don't flinch, and why I am never, ever going to let it go the way it went before. The fire cracked. Sirius Black sat very still, and Harry watched him take the impossible in and turn it over and against every reasonable instinct set it down as true because it explained everything the sidelong reading had already told him and because a man who had spent 12 years in the company of Dementors had lost the luxury of disbelieving in nightmares. Right, Sirius said Horse after a long while. Right. He drained the glass and set it down with a click. Then we'd better win. The cloak came on Christmas morning, and it came the way it had come in the first life, wrapped in brown paper with no name on the sender's line and a note in a looping hand that Harry knew at a glance. Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well. There was no signature because Dumbledore never signed the moves he wanted deniable, and Harry sat on the edge of a four-poster in a cold room that smelled of decades and unfolded the fluid gray silk of his father's invisibility cloak across his small knees and understood exactly what he was holding. It was not merely a cloak. It was one of three, the eldest and truest of them, the cloak that hid its wearer even from death, and it had come down the Peveril line to Potter in Godric's Hollow and been given away at the last to the one man who understood what it was and wanted someday to gather all three. Dumbledore was returning a hallow to its heir and telling himself it was a kindness and knowing in the deep rooms of himself that a hallow in the hands of the one Peveril heir left alive was a thread he could pull on later. Harry let him think so. Harry had watched in another life the old man die of reaching for these three objects, and he had no intention of dying the same way. He would take the cloak because the cloak was his by blood and by right and because a man who could not be seen could go anywhere. The rest of the story he would write differently. He drew the cloak over his shoulders and vanished from the waist down, and the child in him, the part that had never once in either life owned a beautiful thing, went very still. Then he folded it and put it away because he had work to do and the work asked for ruthlessness, and Harry had a good deal of that to spare. Creature was the key to the locket, and Harry had known since the summer exactly how the lock turned. The old elf shuffled out of the shadows under the boiler on the second evening, ancient and filthy, his snout of a nose and his bloodshot eyes full of an old venom worn smooth by years, muttering the old poison under his breath, blood traitor son and shame of my mistress and the nasty little half-blood he's brought into her house. Sirius would have shouted at him, or worse. The two of them had ground each other into ruin in the first life, and it had killed them both in the end. Harry did not shout. Harry sent Sirius upstairs on a made-up errand and knelt down on the filthy kitchen flags so that his eyes were level with the old elf's, which no wizard had done in 100 years, and he spoke the name that opened the only door Creature had left. I know what happened to Regulus, Harry said quietly. I know what he asked you to do, and I know you did it, and I know it broke your heart, and I know you've never once been able to tell a living soul because he ordered you not to, and you have kept that order for 10 years alone in the dark. I've come to finish what he started, Creature. I've come to destroy the locket. The elf went rigid. The muttering stopped. In the terrible silence, the bloodshot eyes came up to Harry's face and searched it with a desperation that had waited a decade for a reason to go on. And when Creature spoke, his cracked voice had lost every ounce of its poison and held only an old grief so large it barely fit inside the withered frame that carried it. Master Regulus, Creature whispered. You know of Master Regulus. I know he was braver than anyone will ever give him credit for, Harry said, and it was true, and he let the truth do the work no lie could have done. I know the Dark Lord took you to a cave and used you to test his defenses and left you to die there, and Regulus found out, and Regulus went back to that cave in your place and made you take the locket and go and told you to destroy it and drank the thing that should have killed you so that you could live. He died in that cave, Creature, for you. And you've carried the locket ever since, and it won't be destroyed no matter what you do to it because it can't be destroyed by any magic you or Regulus ever had. Harry opened his hand, and in it lay a curved yellow fang the length of his forearm, and the old elf stared at it. But I have the magic it can be destroyed by. I killed the thing that grew the poison in that tooth. Bring me the locket, Creature, and I will do the last thing your master asked of you, the thing you've been failing to do for 10 years through no fault of your own. Let me finish it for him. Creature wept the way very old things weep, without dignity and without restraint, and he pressed his wrinkled forehead to the filthy floor at Harry's knees, and then he crept away into the dark of the house and came back cradling the locket of Salazar Slytherin in both hands as though he were carrying a wounded bird, the locket that no fire had melted and no hammer had dented and no elf's devotion had been able to unmake. And he laid it in front of Harry on the kitchen table and looked up at him with everything he had left to give showing in his ruined face. The locket was heavy and cold and wrong. It sat on the scrubbed wood pulsing very faintly, an ornate golden thing with an emerald serpentess worked into its face, and Harry could feel the piece of soul inside it turning toward the nearness of living minds the way a blind thing turns toward warmth. He did not open it at once. He sent Creature to fetch Sirius, because there were witnesses a moment deserved, and he laid the fang beside the locket, and he waited until the two of them stood in the doorway, the ruined man and the ruined elf, before he did what Regulus Black had died trying to do. Open, Harry hissed in parcel tongue, and the locket's golden doors sprang wide, and the thing inside it came out. It came out as it had come out in the first life, a boil of black smoke that took shape in the low kitchen and reared toward the ceiling, and out of the smoke rose living eyes and a mouth, and the eyes were red and the mouth curled, and the shard of Voldemort in the locket looked down at the child who had opened it and began at once to do the only thing it knew how to do, which was to find the softest place in a heart and press. but it had no soft place of Harry's to find. It reached into him for a handhold and found none, no wound it could tear wider, no attachment it could turn to poison, only a cold, flat resolve as old as the war and a mind that had already lost everything the shard might have threatened to take. The smoke roiled, baffled, and turned instead toward the two in the doorway, toward Sirius, whispering of Azkaban and wasted years and a godson who would surely tire of a broken man, toward Creature, whispering of a master who had abandoned him and a mistress who had died ashamed, and Harry heard the whispers begin to find their marks and did not let them land. The shard did what it had always done best, which was to build. Out of the black smoke it raised pictures, and the pictures were cruel and exact, because the locket had lived a decade against the skins of these two and knew the shape of every wound they carried. For Sirius it made the dead, James laughing in a doorway, Lily with a baby on her hip, the whole ruined life the traitor's curse had taken, and over them a whisper that said you were too late for them and you will be too late for this one too, you ruin everything you are given, you always have. For Creature it made his mistress, tall and cold and beautiful in the way the elf had worshipped, turning her back on him, and it whispered that he had failed her, failed Master Regulus, failed the locket, that he was a bad elf, an old broken bad elf who deserved his head on the wall with the rest. Sirius made a low sound and his wand hand trembled. Creature swayed and began to keen. It's showing you the truth twisted just far enough to cut, Harry said, and now there was iron under the level of his voice and it cut across the whispers like a blade across silk. Sirius, James and Lily didn't die because of you, they died because of the thing that made this locket, and it knows that, and it's lying because lying is the only weapon it has left, Creature. Your mistress was a cruel woman who never once deserved you, and Regulus was worth 10 of her, and you did not fail him. You have kept his last order for 10 years alone, which is more faith than any wizard alive has ever shown a friend. The thing in the smoke can't stand that either of you knows it. Look at it, it's getting smaller. And it was because a shard of a soul that fed on being believed starved fast in a room where no one believed it, and the pictures thinned and guttered, and the whispers rose toward a shriek of pure frustration. Don't listen to it, he said, clear and level, without looking away from the smoke. It has nothing. It's a scrap of a dead man's vanity in a locket, and it can only tell you the cruelest version of the things that already keep you awake, because that's all it is, the cruelty cut off from the man with nowhere left to live. Regulus, beat it, Creature, you beat it. It's been screaming in that locket for 10 years because it lost. He lifted the fang. This is what winning sounds like. He drove the basilisk fang into the heart of the locket where it lay open on the table, and the shard screamed out of the smoke, a long rising wail of denial, and the black boil convulsed and thinned and tore apart in the green light of the kitchen. And a gout of something dark and foul burst from the ruined locket and steamed away to nothing on the scrubbed wood, and then the cold went out of the room, and the golden thing lay split and dead and silent, an empty locket at last. 10 years too late for the man who had died to bring it here, and exactly on time for the elf who had carried it. Creature made a sound Harry never wanted to hear from any creature again, and shuffled forward, and gathered the dead broken locket to his chest, and rocked over it on the kitchen floor. When he looked up at Harry, his bloodshot eyes had changed, and Harry knew he had, in the space of a quarter hour, made the most devoted servant in Britain, because he had given a broken thing the one gift no one else had ever thought to offer it, an ending to the long waiting and the truth about the master it had served. Creature will serve, the old elf said in a voice gone strange and formal. Creature will serve the friend of Master Regulus until Creature dies. I know, Harry said gently. And the first thing I need is to go somewhere tomorrow, quietly, where no one will see us come or go. You can take me there and bring me back and tell no one. Can you do that? Creature could, of course. How cells went where their master's business took them, through wards that turned back the greatest wizards alive, and no one in 100 years had thought to watch the roads the elves traveled, because no one in 100 years had thought the elves mattered. Harry had thought the elves mattered. Harry in the war had watched a house elf save his life and give his own for it, and he had learned the lesson written in that small, brave death, that the powerful lose again and again, because they cannot see the servant standing at their elbows holding all the keys. They went to the valley the next morning while Sirius slept off his Christmas brandy, and Creature's magic took them out of the London house and set them down, between one breath and the next, on a frozen hillside above a village Harry knew from a memory that was not, yet, his own to have. Little Hangleton lay gray and small in the valley below, and above it on the wooded hill crouched the ruin of the gaunt shack, and Harry stood in the snow and looked at it and let the cold settle in him alongside all the rest. The last time he had seen this place it had been in a bottle of silver memory, poured into a basin by an old man 3 years from death, part of a lesson in a war Harry had lost. Now the ruin was real under a real winter sky, and inside it, under a rotten floorboard, waited a ring that had killed the greatest wizard of the age and would have killed Harry too in the first life if he had ever been fool enough to reach for it. He was not a fool, he had come prepared. The shack was falling in on itself, its roof holed to the sky, nettles dead and black around the sagging door, a nailed-up snakeskin rotting on the frame where the Gaunts had once announced their poisoned arrogance to the world. It was a small ruin, and a mean one, and the meanness of it told the whole story of the Maker's beginnings better than any book. That the most dangerous wizard of the age had been born of a squalid inbred arrogance in a hovel on a hill, from a mother who died of a longing no man ever returned, and a father who never knew he existed, and that everything he had become since, the immortality, the slaughter, the tearing of his own soul into pieces, had been one long shriek of a wounded child insisting he was more than this dirt-floored room. Harry stood in it a moment and read that story cold, because a man who understood where his enemy came from understood where his enemy could be broken. The old defenses hung thick over the floorboards, and Harry took his time reading them, because haste in a place like this was how a careful man ended a careless corpse. There were curses in the air with teeth, layered one over another by a paranoid genius, and Harry, who had studied every one of them across a lifetime, mapped them by the faint distortions they made in the cold and stepped through the gaps between them the way a man crosses a minefield he has already walked once in a dream. Creature he sent back to the doorway out of the reach of it, because the elf had suffered enough of the Maker's traps for one lifetime. Harry went in alone across the rotten floor with the fang in one hand and his holly wand in the other, and he found the loose board, and he lifted it with the tip of his wand and not with his fingers, and beneath it the golden casket waited in the dark exactly where a memory not yet his own had promised it would be. Inside the casket the ring lay black and heavy, set with a cracked black stone, and worked through all the curses that guarded it was the one Harry had come armored against, the drowning, hungry compulsion to take the ring, to hold it, to slide it onto a finger and turn the stone and let it show him what he most wanted to see. He felt the compulsion reach for him the moment the lid came up. It was cleverer than the locket's whisper. It did not threaten, it offered. It offered his mother, not in words. The ring did not stoop to words. It reached instead into the deepest cellar of him and lifted out the one image he had spent 2 lifetimes refusing to look at directly, and it held the image up in the cold air of the shack until he could almost see it standing there among the dead nettles. A woman with dark red hair and his own green eyes, young, alive, turning toward him with a smile that had never once in either of his lives been aimed at him, because she had died before he was old enough to keep a single memory of her face. The ring promised that smile. The ring promised her voice, which he had heard exactly once, screaming through a door in a nightmare that was also a memory. 3 turns of the stone it whispered without whispering, and she is here. She has been waiting. Only you can call her, and only now, and it will cost you nothing you cannot spare. He knew what the stone was. He knew that this cracked black jewel was the resurrection stone, the second hallow, and that a man who turned it 3 times in his hand could call up the shades of his beloved dead, could stand in a ruined shack on a winter morning and see Lily Potter's face turned toward him, hear her voice, watch her smile at the son she had died for and never seen grow. He knew it was real. He knew it was not a trick of the curse, but the true and terrible gift of the stone, and that was what made it nearly unbearable, because everything the war had taken from him and left him unable to grieve properly was here. 1 turn of a jewel away, and no one would ever know, and it would cost him nothing but the taking. Harry stood over the casket in the freezing ruin and did not reach for it, and holding still cost him more than the basilisk had, more than the fever, more than any spell of the second life, because the basilisk had only wanted to kill him and this only wanted to comfort him, and comfort was the deadlier weapon by far. He made himself say it aloud in the empty shack in a low, cold voice so that the wanting would have to hear the answer. "They're dead," Harry said. "Turning the stone doesn't bring them back. It brings back a shadow that stands where they stood, and it looks at you with their eyes, and it isn't them, and it can't stay, and the man who leans on it too long forgets how to want anything else and dies reaching for a door that only opens one way. I know, I watched him do it." He drew a slow breath of the dead, cold air. "I'm not here to see my mother. I'm here to make sure the thing that killed her can't come back. That's the only visit that keeps her death from being for nothing." He took the fang, and he pinned the ring to the rotten floor with the point of it, and he did not put the ring on, did not touch it with his skin, did not turn the stone even once, and he drove the basilisk venom through the black jewel with a wrench of his whole small body, and the ring screamed. The shard inside it burst out in a shriek of black fire that scorched the broken walls, the fragment of soul that had hidden here longest, in the ruin of the family the Maker had been ashamed of and murdered, and it came apart howling in the winter light and was gone, and the compulsion went out of the air all at once like a held note cut off. And Harry knelt in the sudden silence with the fang in his hand and the cracked black stone lying quiet and dead on the floor at last, only a stone now. A broken jewel with a soul burned out of it and a hallow sleeping in it still. He picked it up. He did not turn it. He wrapped the resurrection stone in a square of cloth and put it away in an inner pocket next to nothing, the way you carry a loaded thing you have decided never to fire, because a hallow was worth keeping and worth denying to everyone else, and because a day might come far off at the very end when a man was allowed to set down a stone and look on the faces of his dead, and Harry meant to earn that day rather than steal it. He stood for a moment in the ruin with the burned ring cooling on the floor and made himself look, one last time, at the place where the compulsion had shown him his mother, and there was nothing there now, only rotten boards and dead nettles and the gray winter light coming through the holed roof. That was the truth the stone had tried to sell him past, that this was all there was, a broken room and an old loss and a job still to be done, and that a man who wanted more than the world could give him would spend his life reaching into rooms like this one for faces that would never stay. He had watched the greatest wizard of the age make exactly that mistake twice, once with a stone and once with a sister, and he did not intend to make it a 3rd time in the same shack. He put the hallow deeper in his pocket where he would not feel it against his hand, and he turned his back on the room without looking again. 2 anchors gone in a single week. He stood in the ruined shack of the Gaunts with his mother's death made to mean something and his father's cloak on his back and a dead hallow in his pocket, and he told Creature quietly to take him home. Snape was waiting for him when term resumed in a manner of speaking, which was to say that Snape had spent the holiday brooding on a first year who spoke a dead woman's name like a claim, and had come to no comfortable conclusion, and was watching Harry now with the wary sideways attention of a man who suspects the ground he stands on. Harry went to him on purpose on the second night back to the potions master's office in the dungeons and knocked, and was admitted with a sneer that did not quite hide the wariness beneath it, and he sat down uninvited in the chair across the cluttered desk with its jars of floating things, and he did the thing he had planned since the summer, which was to hand Severus Snape a truth so large and so unexpected that the man would have no room left in his head to go on pretending Harry was a child. "I know what my mother was to you," Harry said, into the candlelit dark of the office without preamble, and watched the man's face turn to stone. "I know you called her a name you spent the rest of your life regretting, and I know you went to Dumbledore when the Dark Lord marked her for death, and I know you've kept a promise to a dead woman for 10 years by watching over a boy you can't stand to look at because he has her eyes and his father's face. I'm not here to taunt you with it. I'm here because you're the only man in this castle with as good a reason as mine to want the Dark Lord in the ground, and I think it's time the two of us stopped wasting the alliance." Snape had gone very white and very still, the way a man goes still when a stranger reads aloud from his most private diary, and when he spoke his voice was barely a breath and shook with something he could not master. "You cannot know these things, you are a child." "You cannot possibly, I can and I do, and how is a conversation for another year," Harry said gently, and he did not press the how because the mystery of it was worth more than any answer. "Here is what matters tonight. The Dark Lord is not gone, Professor, you know it. You felt your mark stir faint this year, and you've told yourself it was nothing. It was not nothing. He is in this castle on the back of a fool's head under a turban, and he is reaching for stone that will give him back a body, and Albus Dumbledore is letting him reach for it, has built a whole clever trap around it, because Dumbledore wants to see what the Dark Lord will do more than he wants to stop him doing it." Harry let that land and watched it land because it was true, and Snape knew Dumbledore well enough to know it was true. "I am not so patient. I have already taken the stone out of his reach, and I am going to finish him root and branch in a way the old man has never dared to try, and when I do I would rather have Lily's memory standing with me than against me. Think about it, Professor. You spent 10 years protecting her son on a dead woman's account. I'm offering you the chance to avenge her instead." For a long moment the only sound in the office was the guttering of the candle and the faint bubbling of something green in a jar. Then Snape's mouth twisted, and the old cruelty rose in him as a last defense, the way it always rose when he had nothing else. "And I am to take my orders from a child now," he said, soft and venomous. "The great Harry Potter, arbiter of the war, dispensing his little schemes from the Slytherin dormitory. Your father was arrogant too, it killed him. My father was arrogant and it did help kill him, and I look nothing like him where it counts, which you already know because you've been watching me for 4 months waiting for the strut and haven't found it." Harry did not raise his voice, he lowered it, and the lowering was worse. "You don't take orders from me, Professor, you take them from the same place you've taken them for 10 years, from her. All I'm doing is telling you, for the first time in a decade, that there's finally a way to make it mean something. You can go on watching a boy grow up and calling it a debt paid, or you can help me put the man who killed her in the ground so deep that no stone or ring or diary ever brings him back. One of those is only mourning. The other is what you actually want and have never once been allowed to have." Snape's black eyes were fixed on him now with an intensity that had nothing of the sneer left in it, because a man who has organized his whole life around a single unpayable debt does not easily meet someone who is offering calmly to let him pay it. "Say I believed a word of this," he said very low. "Say it, what would you have of me? 3 things for now, keep the mark to yourself. When it stirs you tell me and no one else, not Dumbledore, not anyone. Watch Quirrell and tell me what he does when he thinks no one is looking. And when the old man asks you what you make of the Potter boy and he will ask, you tell him the truth as far as it goes, that the child is quiet and clever and a little haunted and no trouble at all." Harry rose from the chair, small and level in the candlelight. "That last one's the important one, Professor. Dumbledore trusts your judgment of me more than he trusts his own, because he knows how badly you want to find something wrong with me. So the day you tell him there's nothing to find is the day he stops looking. Give me that, and I'll give you the only thing you've wanted since you were 19 years old." He crossed to the door and put his hand on the latch and did not wait for an answer, because the best offers were the ones you let a man refuse and watched him fail to, and Severus Snape, who had spent a decade owing a debt to a ghost, was never in his life going to be able to refuse a chance to pay it in the one coin that had ever mattered to him. He took stock of his servants that night, lying awake in the green underwater dark of the dormitory, and found the ledger heavier than any anchor. A house elf in a cold manor, watching and listening for him out of pure worship. A house elf in a London house, sworn to him past death out of gratitude for an ending to a wound no one else had troubled to notice. A cleared and dangerous man in the daylight world who would move where Harry pointed him. And now the most gifted spy of the age, a man who could lie to the Dark Lord's face and to Dumbledore's in the same afternoon, bound to Harry by the one debt he could never stop trying to pay. Not one of them had been one with force. Everyone had been one with the truth, or with a use for truth delivered to a person the powerful had learned to look straight through. That was the whole method of the second life, laid out plain. The great men of this world spent their strength dueling one another over the heads of the servants who held all the keys, and Harry had simply walked in at knee height and picked the keys up off the floor. The body had paid for the winter's work all the same. 3 anchors in a fortnight, the fever of the binding spell, the long cold hours in the ruin and the cathedral of hidden things, and the equipment that carried his war was still a boy's, and it ached, and it wanted its bed the way a boy's body wants its bed. He let it have that much. A general rested when the front was quiet, and for one night the front was quiet, and Harry Potter slept the thin hard sleep of a soldier between battles and did not dream because he had long ago used up all his nightmares living the thing itself. There was one more anchor within the walls of the castle itself, and Harry did not leave it for another night, because a thing you could take tonight was a thing you were foolish to leave for an enemy to move tomorrow. He went up under his father's cloak in the small hours to the 7th floor, to the stretch of bare wall across from the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy teaching trolls to dance, and he walked the length of it 3 times with a single thought held clear and hard in his mind. I need the place where everything is hidden. On the 3rd pass, a door grew out of the stone where no door had been, tall and iron-bound, and Harry opened it and stepped into a room the size of a cathedral that should not have fit inside the tower that held it. It went up and up, a city of the abandoned, aisles and canyons of it stacked to a vaulted dark, 10 centuries of things hidden away and never reclaimed. Broken furniture and forbidden books and bottles gone to crust, a stuffed troll, a rusted cage, the spoils and secrets and shames of 40 generations of students piled into mountains that leaned and towered and lost themselves in shadow overhead. The dust of it hung in the beam of his wand light like something underwater. And somewhere in that hoard, on a bust in a blonde wig, under a tarnished tiara that a bored schoolgirl had once set there as a joke, sat the lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, the cleverest of the Founder's treasures, and the Maker had hidden it here as a 16-year-old and believed, with all the certainty of a boy who thought himself the only clever person in history, that no one would ever walk these aisles knowing what to look for. Harry knew what to look for. He had walked these aisles once before in a burning castle at the end of a war, chasing this very thing while the world came down around him. And he knew the turn to take and the mountain to round, and he went to it directly, past the vanishing cabinet he did not touch and would deal with in its own time, to the bust with the ugly wig, and he lifted the tarnished diadem down into the light. It was beautiful under the grime, silver-worked fine as frost, set with a single sapphire, and around the band ran the Founder's words worn almost to nothing: "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." And under the silver, curled in the old blue jewel, one more hidden piece of Voldemort's soul turned toward the living warmth of him and began, blind and ancient, to wake. He did not give it the chance to speak. He laid the diadem on the cold stone floor of that cathedral of forgotten things, and he set the point of the basilisk fang against the sapphire, and he drove it home. The diadem shrieked, and black blood boiled out of the jewel, and a shape of smoke tore up out of it, screaming toward the vaulted dark, and came apart before it reached the shadows, unmade, gone, and the silver cracked across and lay quiet, only a broken tiara now, only a schoolgirl's abandoned joke, the cleverness gone out of it forever. The dust settled, the city of the abandoned held its breath and let it go. He left the ruined diadem where it lay, because a broken diadem meant nothing to anyone now, and he drew the cloak close and slipped back out through the iron door into the ordinary corridor, and the wall sealed behind him as though it had never held a cathedral at all. He walked back down to the Slytherin dungeon through the sleeping castle with 3 more anchors dead behind him in a single winter, and a spymaster half-turned in his office, and the whole shape of the endgame narrowing toward its point. 2 anchors left, a cup behind dragons that gold and cunning would open in time, and a sliver behind his own eyes that he would deal with when everything else was ash. Beyond the dungeon walls, the winter held the grounds in its fist, and somewhere under a purple turban a wraith turned over and reached, in the dark, for a stone that was no longer there, and found the place where it had been empty, and began, for the first time in 10 patient years, to understand that something had gone very wrong with the world, and that it could not, for all its genius, imagine what. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The board in the ministry. The cup was the hardest of the anchors, and Harry had always known that when he came to it he would not fight the vault that held it. He would buy the men who owned the vault. It sat far down in the deepest galleries of Gringotts, in the high-security vault of the House of Lestrange, behind a blind dragon and a waterfall that stripped enchantment from thieves, and a hoard cursed to burn and multiply at a stranger's touch. A wizard who went in after it uninvited would come out cooked and buried under a mountain of worthless gold. Harry had watched that very thing nearly happen in the first life at the wrong end of a war. He did not intend to go in after it at all. Goblins did not steal from their own vaults, and they did not need to, because they administered the curses that guarded them and could walk through their own defenses the way a man walks through his own front door. The only question was what it would cost to make them want to. He went down to the bank in the February half-term with Sirius as his visible guardian and a request, made in writing and in advance through the courier line, for an audience not with a teller but with the director. Ragnarok received him in a chamber cut from the living rock a mile beneath London. A low vaulted room lit by veins of luminous mineral in the walls, and hung with the arms and armor of goblin wars the wizarding histories had never bothered to record. The director of Gringotts was old and small and hard as an anvil, and his black eyes had watched 3 human centuries of folly go by, and he did not offer the child a chair, because to a goblin the offering of comfort was a wizard's habit and a form of condescension, and Ragnarok did not condescend to a client who had asked to see him about property. "You are the potter who wanted an accounting," Ragnarok said, "the one who reclaimed his estate and made an enemy of a great man in the same morning. My tellers speak of you, they do not usually speak of children." "I try not to be usual," Harry said. "I've come to bring the bank a problem and its solution in the same breath, director, which I trust will save us both some time. There is an abomination in one of your vaults. I can tell you which and what and how it came to be there and why its presence is a knife held to the throat of everything Gringotts is, and I can hand you the only blade in Britain that will cut it out. In exchange, I want 3 things, and none of them is gold, though there will be gold as well, because I know better than to ask a goblin to work for gratitude." Something moved in the ancient black eyes, the flicker of a creature that had expected a supplicant and found a merchant. "Speak of the abomination," Harry spoke of it. He told the director, in the flat exact register that goblins respected above all human music, what a Horcrux was. A fragment of a living wizard's soul, torn loose by murder and sealed into an object, an anchor that kept its maker from dying no matter how his body was destroyed. He told him that the Dark Lord the wizarding world believed dead had made several, and that one of them had been smuggled into Gringotts a decade ago and lay even now in the Lestrange vault, a cup of Helga Hufflepuff's fouled with a scrap of the darkest soul in Britain. He watched the director's face as he said it, and he saw what he had come to see. No flinch, for goblins do not flinch from the dark, but the cold proprietary affront of a bank that has been made a fool of without its knowledge, because a client had used the vaults as a hiding place for a sole weapon without the bank's leave, and to a goblin there was no crime in the world quite so obscene as making Gringotts an unwitting party to a fraud. "You understand what this means for the bank," Harry said, gently. "If it were known, if it were ever whispered in the alley, that a Death Eater slipped a piece of the Dark Lord's soul past your wards and kept it in your care for 10 years while your curse-breakers walked the galleries none the wiser, what would that do to the one thing Gringotts sells above gold and above steel, which is the certainty that nothing gets past a goblin? I am not threatening to tell it, director. I would never be so crude, and I would never be believed over the bank in any case. I am pointing out that we both have the same interest in the thing being quietly gone." Ragnarok was silent for a long moment, and then he showed his teeth, which in a goblin was not a smile but the acknowledgement of a worthy stroke. "You reason like one of us. It is unsettling in a soft pink thing of 11 years. Name your 3. First, the abomination is removed from the Lestrange vault by the bank's own hands, through the bank's own curses, at no risk to any of us, and I am permitted to be present when it is destroyed because I have earned the sight of it. Second, the blade that destroys it is mine and returns to me after a basilisk fang from a basilisk I killed myself, which I mention because you will want to verify it and because I would rather you respected me than went easy on me. Third." Harry paused, and here he offered the thing that turned a transaction into an alliance. Because a wise man did not merely pay a goblin, he made the goblin want him to prosper. "Third, when I come into my full inheritance and my seat on the Wisengamot, and I will, sooner than anyone expects, I will carry into that chamber the one cause no wizard has carried in 300 years. The return of goblin-wrought treasures held wrongfully by wizarding houses, and the right of your people to reclaim what your smiths made. I do not offer this as charity. I offer it because your enemies are my enemies, director, and a potter who owes the goblin nation a public debt is worth more to you alive and rising than any vault in this bank." The chamber was very still. Ragnarok looked at the child in the mineral light for a long time, weighing him the way goblins weighed everything, by its true value and not its appearance, and what he saw evidently satisfied the oldest arithmetic in the world. "The fee will be considerable," the director said. "I should think so," said Harry. "I'd trust it less if it were cheap." They did it 3 days later in a warded chamber off the deep galleries, and Harry stood between 2 goblin curse-breakers and watched them bring the cup up out of the Lestrange vault inside a lead casket that damped the Gemino and Flagrante curses to nothing, and open it, and set the little golden thing on a plinth of cold iron. Hufflepuff's cup was lovely, and it was wrong, a 2-handled goblet of worked gold with a badger etched on its face, and around it the air had the greasy shimmer Harry had learned to read as the nearness of a torn soul. He took his fang from the goblin who had verified it and weighed it and returned it to him with a nod of hard respect, and he set the point against the gold. "Open," he told it in parcel tongue, and the cup's small soul woke and knew him, and had time for exactly one shriek of that cold, cultured denial before Harry drove the fang through it, and the thing inside came apart in a bowl of black that the goblins watched with the unmoved professional interest of a people who had seen every foul thing wizards could do and been impressed by none of it. The cup lay split and dead. The greasy shimmer went out of the air. One of the curse breakers made a note in a ledger, because to a goblin even the death of a piece of the Dark Lord's soul was first and last a transaction to be recorded. The older of the 2 curse breakers, a scarred veteran whose name Harry made a point of learning and keeping, looked from the dead cup to the fang in the child's hand and then for a long moment at Harry himself, with an expression Harry had earned from very few of any race in either of his lives. You killed the basilisk that grew this, the goblin said. It was not quite a question. Alone, a serpent of the founder's age. I did, and you brought its tooth to our bank and used it to unmake a piece of the darkest soul in Britain and asked us in return not for protection but for a promise to fight for our people in your parliament. The goblin studied him. Wizards have come to Gringotts for 1,000 years, small speaker, and they have wanted our gold and our vaults and our secrets and now and then our blood. You are the first in my long life to come wanting to owe us. I do not know yet whether that makes you the most dangerous wizard I have met or the only honest one. Perhaps they are the same thing. He returned the fang with a bow that goblins did not give, a small, precise inclination of the head that Harry understood to be worth more than any vault, and Harry returned it exactly, and something passed between the two of them that would matter very much before the end. 5 anchors gone. Only the cup had needed another's hands, and Harry had bought those hands and made a friend of the arm they belonged to, and he climbed back up through the galleries of Gringotts with a debt of gold against his vault and a debt of honor owed him by the Goblin Nation, and counted the trade a bargain at 10 times the price. The debt of honor was the true prize, and it was worth more than the destroyed cup, because gold could be spent once and a nation's regard could be spent again and again. In the first life, the goblins had been no one's allies, courted by neither side, ground between the wizarding factions and trusting none of them, and it had cost the light 100 advantages it never knew it had foregone. Harry had spent one morning and one basilisk fang and one honest promise, and bought what a war had failed to buy. The goodwill of the oldest and most underestimated power in Britain, a people who forgot nothing, who kept every ledger, who administered the vaults where the whole wizarding economy slept in the wards no wizard could pass. A wizard with the goblins at his back had eyes in every great house that banked at Gringotts, which was all of them, and a lever under every fortune in the country. Harry did not intend to use those eyes and levers crudely or often. He intended simply to have them, the way a careful man keeps a key to a door he may never need to open, because the whole art of the second life was to have arranged, long before the hour of need, every advantage the first life had learned to wish for too late, which left the men. The anchors were craft, the men were politics, and Harry had come over the second life to understand that politics was only craft practiced on creatures too vain to admit they could be moved. Lucius Malfoy was the lock through which the whole ministry turned, and Harry meant to pick it before the spring was out. He arranged the meeting through Sirius, because Sirius was now Lord Black, head of the most ancient house in Britain and the blood cousin of Lucius's own wife, and a summons from the head of House Black to discuss a matter of family was a thing even Lucius Malfoy could not refuse without insult. They took a private room at a discreet establishment in Diagon Alley, and Sirius sat at the head of the table looking every inch the aristocrat he had been born and hated being, and Harry sat at his side small and quiet, and to Lucius's eye merely the famous godson brought along for reasons of sentiment, until the moment Harry began to speak and the reasons rearranged themselves. Lucius came in gleaming, silver-headed and serpent-caned and secure, and he made his cool courtesies to his wife's cousin and his cooler notice of the Potter boy, and he sat, and he waited to be told what tiresome family matter required his afternoon. Harry gave him a moment to be comfortable, then he took it away. "You're missing a book, Mr. Malfoy," Harry said pleasantly into the polished quiet. "A small black diary you kept in a false drawer in your study. You haven't opened that drawer in some weeks, so you don't know it's gone yet, but it is, and I have it, and I know what it is, and I know what you were told to do with it, and I know what it would have done to a little girl if you'd ever been permitted to do it. I thought you should hear that from me directly before we discuss the rest." The color went out of Lucius Malfoy's face by degrees, the way frost goes across a pane, and his hand tightened on the head of his cane, and for a moment the polished mask slipped and showed the thing beneath, which was a man who had spent 10 years and a great deal of gold persuading the world he had never truly been what he was, hearing a child recite the one secret that could unmake all of it. "I do not know," he began in a voice gone thin, "what a schoolboy imagines he don't," Harry said without heat, and the single quiet word cut the sentence off cleaner than a shout could have. "We haven't the time and you haven't the footing. Let me tell you what I know, and you can decide afterward how much of your dignity you'd like to spend denying it. I know your master gave you that diary and did not tell you it held a piece of his soul, because he did not trust you with the truth, because he never trusted any of you with anything that mattered. I know how you got your name off the rolls after the First War and what you paid and to whom, and how much of it was imperious and how much was gold. I know which votes in the Wisengamot you own and what you paid for them. I have it the way I had Peter Pettigrew, Mr. Malfoy, and you saw what became of him, and you have surely wondered, these past months, what sort of hand reaches into the ministry and pulls a man out of a decade of hiding with a single letter no one can trace." Harry let that sit and watched the aristocrat understand at last whose table he was truly sitting at. "It's a very small hand, it's this one, and it is holding at this moment everything you have spent your life protecting." The room was silent. Sirius, at the head of the table, said nothing and let his terrible calm do its work, and Lucius Malfoy looked from the man to the child and back and arrived visibly at the bottom of his situation. "What do you want?" he said. It was not a question any longer. It was a surrender dressed in 3 words. Less than you're bracing for, and I'll take it quietly, and you'll keep your name and your manor and your seat, which is more mercy than your master ever showed a servant who failed him. Harry counted it off, flat, final. First, you will free your house elf, today, a garment, a word done. Second, you will use every galleon of influence you own to see the Potter proxy withdrawn from Albus Dumbledore and returned to its rightful line before the summer session. And you will do it gladly, because you have wanted the old man humbled longer than I've been alive, and I am handing you the chance to wound him without the risk of being seen to try. Third, from this day, the votes you own and the men you've bought answer in the matters I care about to me through channels we will arrange, and you will find that I ask for very little and always in your interest, so that in a year you will have half convinced yourself we are allies rather than what we are. He met the pale gray eyes and held them. Refuse any part of it, and the same courier who buried Pettigrew delivers the rest of you to Amelia Bones by Friday. I would rather not. But I will not hesitate either, and you have looked long enough now to know that's true. Lucius Malfoy sat with his cane across his knees and his knuckles white on its silver head, and for a long moment he did the arithmetic of a vain man who has just been shown, item by item, that he owns nothing he thought he owned. Harry watched him do it. He watched Lucius consider defiance and set it down because defiance required a wand at your throat, and this was worse. This was a child across a table with a courier and a dossier and a year of proof that the threats he made came true. He watched Lucius consider running and set that down too because a Malfoy without his manor and his name and his seat was nothing. And this small quiet creature was offering almost graciously to let him keep all three in exchange for a leash he would scarcely feel. And he watched the exact moment the man arrived at the only door left open to him, which was to pretend even to himself that he had chosen it. You are not, Lucius said at last, very low, working to reassemble the mask over the ruin of his composure, what the world believes you to be, Mr. Potter. No, Harry agreed. Almost no one is, but I'm the version of me that keeps your family out of Azkaban, Mr. Malfoy, so I'd encourage you to value the difference. He rose, and Sirius rose with him, unhurried, and the two of them left the aristocrat sitting alone in the private room with his cane and his wine and the wreckage of a certainty he had spent a lifetime building. And Sirius did not say a word until they were out in the alley and the cold spring air was on their faces, and then he let out a long breath and looked down at his godson with something that was not quite comfort. I've watched grown men break other men, Sirius said. In the Order, in the war. It took hexes, usually threats you could see coming. He shook his head slowly. You did it to Lucius Malfoy with a book he didn't know was missing, and you're 11 and you didn't raise your voice once. I'm not sure whether to salute you or run for the hills. Both, Harry said. That's the correct response. Keep it. It'll keep you honest about what you've thrown in with. And he meant it kindly, and Sirius took it as it was meant, and the two of them walked up the alley together in the failing light, the man and the child, the last free marauder and the general wearing a schoolboy, and no one who passed them gave the pair a second glance. Lucius Malfoy freed Dobby that same evening, and the elf came to Harry weeping and free and swore himself into Harry's service of his own will, which was worth 10 of a binding. And within the fortnight the machinery of Malfoy influence had begun invisibly to turn a new way, and the most powerful of the old serpents in the Ministry Garden had become, without quite being able to say when it had happened, a limb of the very hand that now held his whole life. Dobby came to Harry the night of his freeing, out of the air beside the lake at the edge of the Hogwarts grounds where Harry had walked out to meet him under the cloak, and the elf was dressed now in a pillowcase of his own choosing and clutched a single sock as though it were a knighthood, and he could barely speak for the enormity of what had been done for him. Harry crouched in the reeds and let the little creature weep himself out, and then he gave him what Dobby wanted more than freedom, which was purpose. He would carry messages no owl could be trusted with. He would watch the doors of the powerful and hear the things spoken behind them, because a free elf went unremarked in 100 houses where a wizard could not set foot. He would answer to Harry and to no one else. Dobby swore it on the sock in the lake in his own small fierce heart and vanished into the dark to begin, and Harry walked back up to the castle and added another line to the ledger. He kept the ledger clear in his mind those spring nights, and it had become a thing of quiet astonishment even to him. A house elf freed from the greatest of the dark houses, sworn to him by choice, another sworn to him past death out of an old debt healed, the most gifted spy in Britain turned by a truth about a dead woman, a cleared lord in the daylight world moving the Wisengamot at his word, a Death Eater's whole machine of bribes and votes bent quietly to his design. The Goblin Nation owed him a debt of honor and holding one in return, and not a single one of these acquisitions had cost him a duel, a curse, or one drop of blood spilled in the taking of it. He had taken the board apart with letters and truths and the leverage of things people did not know he knew, and the war that was coming had been strangled so quietly that its intended architects had not yet noticed the corpse. That was power, not the wand, never really the wand. The wand was only what you reached for when the clever instruments had failed, and Harry's clever instruments had not failed once. The Ministry was the last and largest of the locks, and Harry did not so much pick it as let it pick itself, because a government was only a machine for turning the self-interest of powerful men into policy, and Harry had spent the winter buying the self-interest of enough powerful men. He never once set foot in the Ministry himself, and this was deliberate, because a child lobbying the corridors of power was a spectacle, and a spectacle was the opposite of what he wanted. He worked instead through two proxies and a rumor. Sirius, as Lord Black, took up the seat his house had held for 800 years and had left empty for 12, and he attended the sessions and asked the questions Harry gave him and voted the way Harry advised. And the Wisengamot, which had written Sirius Black off as a broken ruin, found instead a sharp and sober lord returned from the dead with the whole weight of a great house behind him. Lucius, from the other bench, moved the votes he owned quietly in the same direction and told himself he was hedging. And Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, a fretful, timid man who governed by finding out which way the powerful were leaning and then leaning that way himself with great conviction, felt the House of Black and the House of Malfoy drift into an unlikely alignment on a handful of matters and did what Fudge always did, which was to hurry to the front of the parade and pretend he had called it. Harry read the prophet each morning at the Slytherin table and watched his invisible hand move the pieces. A committee on the oversight of executors proposed by Lord Black quietly established. A review of the wartime convictions granted without trial, announced by the minister to great applause, its findings certain to embarrass the men who had signed them. A softening here and there in the ministry's ancient cruelty toward goblins and elves and the other peoples it had spent centuries grinding down, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone could point to, only the first hairline cracks in a wall Harry meant in time to bring down entirely. None of it bore his name, all of it bore his design. He was learning the deepest lesson of power, the one Dumbledore had known and Voldemort had never grasped, that the man who needs to be seen to rule does not truly rule at all, and that the surest throne in the world is the one no one knows is occupied. The Wisengamot proxy came home in April. It came home through the goblins and the law and Lucius's greased and reluctant influence all at once. A petition to dissolve the regency over the Potter estate on the grounds that the executor had failed for a decade to render an accounting to the heir, filed with documents no one could refute because they were true, and the Wisengamot. With Malfoy-owned votes swinging quietly behind it and Lord Black speaking gravely in its favor, and no wizard willing to stand up and argue that Harry Potter should be denied his own inheritance, granted it almost without debate. Albus Dumbledore did not contest it. That was the tell Harry had been waiting for. A man who fought would have shown his hand. A man who yielded a small square without a word was a man saving his strength for the board's true center, and Harry knew, the day the proxy came home to him, that the old man had at last stopped watching the shadow and begun, in earnest, to hunt the thing that cast it. Dumbledore asked to see him in the last week of April in the round tower office at the top of the moving stair, and Harry went, because a summons you were sure to receive was a battle you did better to choose the ground of, and he had chosen this one long ago. The office was as he remembered it, the silver instruments turning and puffing on their spindly tables, the portraits of old headmasters pretending to doze, the sorting hat on its shelf, the sword of Godric Gryffindor in its case, and on his golden perch the phoenix, Fawkes, watching the child come in with the ancient patient eyes of a creature that had burned and been reborn more times than the castle had stood. Dumbledore sat behind his desk, and he did not offer sherbet lemons, which told Harry more than any speech about how the season had changed between them. "Sit, Harry," the old man said. "We are past the point, I think, where either of us gains anything by pretending. I have watched you all year. I have watched a diary of secrets I did not know existed vanish from the world. I have watched a man walk out of Azkaban that I to my lasting discredit left there. I have watched the deepest vaults of Gringotts do a thing they have not done in living memory, and a proxy I held in trust slip out of my hands through legal channels a child should not know how to reach, and I have felt all year something moving through my school and my world with a purpose and a knowledge it should not possess." He folded his long hands on the desk. "I no longer believe you are an ordinary boy, however extraordinary his history. I would like very much to know what you are." "I know you would," Harry said, and sat and folded his own small hands and mirrored the old man across the desk with a composure that was its own kind of answer. "And I'll give you more than you expect and less than you want, headmaster, because I think we've reached the place where a little honesty buys us both more than another season of feints. So, let me tell you what I know and you can decide from that how much of a boy I am." He told him, not everything, never everything. But he told the old man that he knew about the prophecy, the whole of it, the one Sybil Trelawney had spoken in a room above a pub, the one that named a child born as the 7th month died who would have power to end the Dark Lord and be marked as his equal. He told him that he knew the Dark Lord was not dead but bodiless, and had been in the castle all year under a turban, reaching for stone. He told him that he knew the peace of the Dark Lord's soul was not only in objects but in a living child behind a scar, and that Dumbledore had known it too for years, and had built a long, patient education around the single terrible fact that the child would one day have to walk into the dark and let himself be killed so that the fragment would die with him. He said it all quietly, without accusation, laying each card face up on the desk, and he watched the greatest wizard of the age go pale and still as the extent of what the child knew rolled over him. "You plan for me to die," Harry said gently into the ringing silence. "Not out of cruelty, I've never once thought it was cruelty. You planned it because you care for the world more than you've ever let yourself care for any single person in it, and because you carry 100 years of the dead on your back and you decided long ago that one more, even a child's, even a child who had grown on you, was a price the world was worth. I understand you better than you think, headmaster. I might be the only person alive who does. And I'm telling you across this desk that I have already begun to make your plan unnecessary, and that when I'm finished the child of the prophecy will not have to die because the thing he was meant to die to destroy will already be ash. He held the blue eyes, which had gone bright with something the old man had not shown anyone in 50 years. You spent your whole life preparing to spend me. I'm offering to spend myself my own way and win. All I need from you is that you let me. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, and then he tried, because he was Albus Dumbledore and he did not surrender a board simply because a piece had moved unexpectedly. You speak of destroying the Dark Lord's anchors, he said, slowly, watching Harry with an attention that could have counted the beats of a smaller person's pulse. You speak of it as a thing already half done. But you are a child of 11, however old your eyes have become, and the magic required to unmake such objects is not taught in this school nor in any school. There's one blade in Britain that will do it, and it hangs in a case behind me, and it has not left this office. So either you are telling me a story you cannot possibly have made true, or you have found a second such blade, which would mean you have done something no wizard has managed in 1,000 years. I find I cannot decide which of those unsettles me more. Then don't decide, Harry said. It isn't a thing you need to know, and a man who insists on knowing everything before he'll let anything happen is exactly the man who let my parents die waiting for certainty. You taught me that, headmaster, in a life you don't remember. You were the cleverest man in every room you ever entered, and it made you slow because you always had one more piece to move before the last one more secret to keep, one more year to let the child grow before you spent him. I'm faster than you because I've stopped needing to be the cleverest man in the room. I only need to be the one who already knows how it ends. He let the old man sit with that. You asked where I found the prophecy and the truth of my scar. You already know I can't have found them, so sit with the impossibility of it, the way you've made everyone else in your life sit with the impossibilities you carried, and decide whether a thing you can't explain but can verify is a thing you'd rather fight or use. I'd use it in your place, but then I'm not you, that's rather the point. For a long moment Albus Dumbledore did not speak, and the silver instruments turned and the phoenix watched, and something enormous shifted in the room, the whole balance of a lifetime tilting on the fulcrum of a child who had just laid out the old man's darkest secret as calmly as a shopping list. When Dumbledore spoke at last, his voice had lost its comfortable music and found something rower underneath. Who told you these things? He whispered. The prophecy has never left this room and one other. The matter of your scar I have shared with no living soul. You cannot have learned them, and yet you have. What are you, Harry? Someone who has already paid for all of it once, Harry said, and did not explain because the mystery was the leverage and the leverage was the whole point, and does not intend to pay for it twice. You don't have to trust me, headmaster. You only have to do what you're best at in all the world, which is nothing, patiently, while a plan you can't see plays out to an end you'll like. Watch me, check everything I've said, you'll find it true. And when the Dark Lord's last anchor is gone and the war that was coming simply never comes, you can decide then whether the thing that saved your world was a boy or a miracle or something you'd rather not name. Until then, keep my secret as I've kept yours and stay out of my way, and we'll neither of us have to find out what happens when we stop being on the same side. He rose and he left the old man sitting behind his desk in the turning silver light with the sword of Gryffindor gleaming in its case and the phoenix quiet on its perch. And he did not look back, and behind him Albus Dumbledore, who had not flinched from anything since a green summer in 1899, sat very still and looked at the closed door for a long, long time and began at last to be afraid of the future in an altogether new way, because the future had begun. After 100 still years, to move faster than he could, what followed the confrontation was the thing Harry had gambled the whole exchange to win, which was not Dumbledore's trust and not his help but his stillness. Snape, who watched the headmaster more closely than anyone, brought the report a week later in the dungeon dark, his face unreadable as ever, his voice careful. The old man had grown quiet. He had cancelled 2 journeys abroad and spent his evenings in the tower, and he had begun very discreetly to verify, to check the vaults, to inquire after a certain diary, to confirm that a certain man had truly been the Potter's secret keeper. And every check had come back true, and each truth had made the old man quieter still, because a thing you cannot explain but can confirm at every point is far more unsettling than a lie, and the confirmations were closing around Albus Dumbledore like the walls of a room he could not find the door of. He has not spoken your name to me since, Snape said. He asked me once whether you seemed troubled. I told him you seemed a quiet, clever, haunted child, exactly as you instructed. He looked at me a long time and said, yes, that is precisely what worries me. The faintest edge came into the potion's master's voice, something almost like respect and almost like a warning. You have made the greatest wizard alive too wary to move Potter, and you did it by telling him the truth. I have served 2 masters of deception in my life, and neither of them ever thought of that. That's because neither of them ever had the truth on their side, Harry said. It's the one weapon nobody guards against. He looked up at the man who had once died for a memory of his mother and would not this time if Harry had anything to say about it. Keep watching him. He'll hold still as long as the checks keep coming back true and the war keeps failing to arrive. The day either of those changes, he'll move, and when he moves it will be with everything he has. But that day is mine to choose, not his, and I don't intend to choose it until there's nothing left of the enemy for him to save the world from. The last weeks of the school year ran down toward the summer, and in the third-floor corridor a trap that Dumbledore had built with such care sat baited and useless, guarding a stone that a wraith could no longer reach, because the child who was meant to stumble into that trap in June had already emptied it in the winter and told no one. Quirrell grew thinner and stranger. The scar woke more often now, and the thing behind the turban had begun to thrash against the walls of its own failure, sensing in its blind and ancient way that everything it had schemed for a decade to achieve had somehow already slipped through its fingers, and unable, for all its genius, to understand how. Harry felt it fraying through the link and knew the last confrontation was near, and made ready in the quiet to finish the thing he had come back through death itself to end. 6 pieces of the enemy's soul had begun the year. One remained in the world outside of Harry, a wraith on the back of a dying man's head reaching still for a stone it would never find. And one remained behind Harry's own eyes, quiet, patient, waiting for the reckoning he had promised it since the first gray morning under the stairs. The board was very nearly clear. Only the 2 hardest squares were left, and they were the same square in a way, the enemy and the sliver of the enemy that lived in him, and Harry walked down the moving stair into the last of the school year with the whole of it laid out before him and the end finally in sight. He had come back through death with a single thing that no one else on the board possessed, and he had spent a whole school year proving what that one thing was worth. Not power. He was still 3 feet tall and tired early and could cast only so many great spells before the body rebelled. Not allies, though he had gathered more of those than the Order of the Phoenix had managed in a war. What he had, the thing that had emptied 5 anchors and turned 4 servants and boxed the 2 most dangerous men in Britain into their corners, was foreknowledge plain and total, the map of a game already played, and he had used it the way a grandmaster uses a book he has memorized against an opponent who thinks he is inventing the moves for the first time. The war that had eaten his whole first life was not going to be fought. He had reached into the cradle where it slept and closed his small hand around its throat, and the only thing left was to make sure it never drew breath at all. 2 squares, the wraith and the sliver behind his eyes. He turned them over one last time as the stair carried him down into the ordinary noise of the school, and went to make ready for the reckoning he had promised the enemy since the first gray morning under the stairs. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. The hollow crown of all the pieces on the board, the 2 that remained were the 2 that could not be reached with gold or law or a letter in a stranger's hand, because one of them was a wraith with no body to arrest and the other lived behind Harry's own eyes and shared his blood and his sight and in the small hours something dangerously close to his dreams. He had left them for last because they were the same problem wearing 2 faces. The wraith on the back of Quirrell's skull and the sliver behind Harry's scar had been torn from the same soul on the same night in the same cottage, and the thread that ran between them, the thread the whole wizarding world called a cursed scar and Harry alone understood to be a door, was the one weapon in this war that cut both ways. Voldemort had used that door in the first life to pour visions and lies and once his whole ruined self into Harry's mind. Harry intended to use it now for the opposite purpose, and the plan he had built around it was the most dangerous thing he had attempted in either life, because it required him to open the door on purpose and invite the enemy through it. There was no other way. He had turned it over 100 nights in the green underwater dark of the dormitory, looking for a road that did not run straight through his own skull, and there was none. A Horcrux was destroyed by ruining its vessel past the reach of any healing, and the vessel of this last fragment was a living child of 11 who intended to go on living. Basilisk venom would purge it and stop his heart in the same breath. Fiendfire would burn it out of a body already ash. The one method the first life had proved could kill the fragment and spare the host was the one Dumbledore had built his whole terrible plan around. The fragment could take a death meant for Harry, absorb the unmaking, and die in his place, leaving the child alive. But that method required a killing curse and a protection older than the curse and a great deal of luck, and Harry did not intend to leave any of it to luck. And above all, he did not intend to die again, not even for a moment, not even a little. So he had spent the spring building a better version of the old accident deliberately, piece by piece, until he had turned a thing that had happened to him once by chance into a thing he could make happen on purpose, on his ground at his hour. And the hour had come. The shape of the plan was simple to say and terrible to do. He would not go looking for the fragment inside himself and try to cut it out, because it was woven through his flesh like dye through cloth and could not be lifted clear. He would instead give it a reason to gather. The fragment and the wraith were 2 ends of one severed soul, and Harry had learned in the first life the one truth about them that the Maker had never grasped, that they yearned toward each other, that a piece of a soul in one place strained always toward the greater piece in another, wanting to be whole. So he would open the door and let the greater piece come flooding home to the lesser, and in the instant the 2 reached for each other and fused, the whole of the enemy that remained in the world would be gathered into a single place inside Harry's mind, condensed out of his flesh and into one exposed and separate thing, a boil brought to a head, a target. And in that instant, and only that instant, it could be destroyed as a unit torn loose and cast out and unmade without taking Harry with it, because for that one heartbeat it would be a thing inside him rather than a thing woven into him. The margin for error was the width of a heartbeat. If he moved too soon, the wraith would not yet be gathered and would keep its grip on his body. If he moved too late, the fused soul would begin to spread back into his flesh and set roots he could not tear out, and it would wear him into the world as its own, and Harry Potter would end in the dark under the school and something far older would walk up the pipe in his skin. He had one attempt. He was 11 years old, 3 feet of him, his hands too small for the wand at his side, and he was about to invite the greatest dark wizard of the age into the one room where a mistake could not be corrected. And whatever the small body felt about that, he had put it somewhere he could not reach it, because a man about to walk a wire does not look down. Quirrell was dying. Anyone with eyes could see it, and Harry had better eyes than anyone. The thing on the back of the man's head had drained him for a year and had nothing left to show for it. No stone, no body, no victory, only a host worn down to gray paper and a mounting, blind, uncomprehending hunger to destroy that Harry felt through the scar like heat off a fire in another room. The Wraith knew now that something had gone catastrophically wrong. It could not name what. It had reached for the stone and found the trap emptied. It had reached in its dreams toward the anchors that had always hummed at the edge of its awareness. The diary, the ring, the cup, the locket, the diadem, the deep sure sense of its own scattered immortality. And one by one over the year those hums had gone silent, and the Wraith had told itself it was imagining the silence, because the alternative was a thing too enormous for even its genius to hold. That someone somewhere was unmaking it and knew how and was winning. Harry decided to end the Wraith's uncertainty. He decided to tell it the truth, because the truth was the cruelest weapon he owned, and because a cornered enemy made mistakes. He chose the night and he chose the ground, and the ground was the Chamber of Secrets, because it was a killing floor already, sealed and secret and a mile from any help, and because there was a poetry to it that the strategist in him disdained and the man in him could not quite give up. That the last of the Dark Lord should meet his end in the drowned hall his own ancestor had built to breed monsters, at the hands of a boy standing over the bones of the greatest monster of all. He opened the door in his mind at midnight, alone, kneeling on the wet stone beneath the graven face of Salazar Slytherin, with a basilisk fang laid across his knees and his father's cloak pooled at his side, and the cracked black stone a hard weight in his pocket that he did not touch. The chamber received him the way it received everything. In silence, its drowned columns marching away into a dark his low flame could not end, the graven face of Salazar Slytherin looming over him with its stone eyes full of 1,000 years of patience, and at the far end half seen the green ruin of the basilisk he had killed in the second week of the second life. He had come full circle to this place. He had opened the war here with a rooster and a closed pair of eyes, and he meant to close it here, and there was a rightness to that which the strategist in him distrusted and used anyway, because men fought harder on ground that meant something to them, even armies of one. He had spent the year learning to keep the door shut. A clumency in a child's brain was a wall built of green wood, and he had built it anyway, board by board, until the Wraith's idle probing slid off him unnoticed. Now he did the harder thing. He took the wall down. He let the scar come fully awake, the old hot wire flaring to brand, and the pain of it was extraordinary, a white spike driven through the front of his skull, the price of opening a door that had been built to stay one way. He rode the pain as he had ridden 100 worse things in the first life, from a slight distance, watching it rather than drowning in it, and he reached out along the thread that the pain lit up in the dark, a filament of connection running away from him into a vast cold elsewhere, and he followed it hand over hand into the dark at the far end. He reached along it deliberately the way you reach down a lightless corridor toward a sound you have decided to face, and at the end of the corridor he found the thing that had shared his skull for 10 years, coiled and vast and blind, and he did not flinch from the touch of it, and he spoke into it, mind to ruin mind, in the cold flat register he had used on goblins and lords and old men all year. "I know you can hear me," Harry said into the dark behind the enemy's eyes. "You felt me at the edge of your sleep all year and told yourself I was a dream. I'm not a dream, I'm the reason the stone was gone. I'm the reason the trap was empty, I'm the silence where your anchors used to be." The response came like a cold front moving through a warm room, a vast attention swinging round to fix on him, incredulous, and under the incredulity the first thread of something the Wraith had not felt in a decade. "You are the Potter child," it said, and its voice in the shared dark was exactly as Harry remembered it and worse for being patient, a high cold whisper that had ordered 1,000 deaths without ever once raising itself. "A first year, a boy, you dare to reach for me." "I've done more than reach for you," Harry said. "I've spent a year unmaking you and you slept through the whole of it. That is the thing you have never once been able to grasp in all your long clever life, that the people you dismiss are the people who kill you. You dismissed a servant and she brought me the diary. You dismissed the goblins and they opened the vault. You dismissed a house elf your own cruelty left for dead and he handed me the locket. And you dismissed a child, most of all a child, because you decided in an orphanage a lifetime ago that no one smaller or younger or weaker than yourself could ever be a danger to you, and so you built your whole immortality on that one assumption, and I am the assumption coming due. I'm reaching for you to tell you it's over," Harry said. "Your diary is a burned book on the floor of this chamber. Your ring is a cracked stone. Your locket is split. Your cup is split. Your diadem is a broken tiara in a room you thought no one would ever find. I destroyed them, all of them, this winter, one at a time, with the tooth of the serpent your ancestor bred. You are not immortal anymore. You are not even safe. You are a scrap of a dead man's soul riding a corpse that hasn't finished dying, and I know exactly where you are, and I have come to finish it." He let the silence stretch, and then he gave it the last and cruelest turn, And here is the part your genius will find hardest to bear. I've had a year to do this. A whole year working under your very nose, and you never once suspected a child because you have never in your long life been able to imagine that anyone smaller than you could be your equal. That blindness is the flaw that made every Horcrux, and it is the flaw that is going to kill you tonight. He felt the Wraith's composure come apart. He felt the incredulity curdle into a white silent heat, the reaction of a creature told in precise detail of its own death, and under the heat for the first time in a decade, something colder that even it could not name, because the thing behind the turban had built its entire existence on the certainty that it could not die, and a child had just recited item by item the dismantling of that certainty, and every item had rung true against the silence the Wraith had spent a year refusing to hear. It did the thing Harry had known it would do, the only thing a creature like that could do when its immortality was stripped away in a single sentence. It came for him. He drew back out of the link and opened his eyes in the chamber, and he waited, kneeling on the wet stone under the Founder's face, and it did not take long. Quirrell came down the pipe an hour before dawn. Harry heard him long before he saw him, the scrape and slither of a body coming down the great pipe too fast for safety, and then Quirrell spilled out onto the wet stone at the foot of the descent and hauled himself upright and came on across the chamber floor toward the small figure waiting under the Founder's face. He came the way a man comes when something else is driving his legs, jerking too fast, his turban gone and his robes filthy from the descent, and in the light of Harry's low blue flame the professor's face was a ruin, gray and starved and slick with sweat, and his eyes were not his own. Behind them in them Harry could feel the Wraith staring out, and the scar on his forehead was a bar of white fire, and he let it burn and did not so much as lift a hand to it, because a man who shows the enemy his pain has already given away the first move. Harry rose to meet him, small in the vast dark, the fang held loose at his side, and he looked at the shaking wreck of a man who had once shaken his hand in the leaky cauldron and felt nothing that he permitted to slow him. "P.P. Potter," Quirrell said, and it was Quirrell's stammer, and then the stammer fell away and another voice came up through it, higher and colder and terribly clear, speaking through the front of the man's face while the thing that owned it pressed against the back of his skull. "No, not Quirrell, you reached for me, boy, you reached across the dark and told me my own death like a bedtime story. Let me look at you. Let me see the face of the child who imagines he has unmade Lord Voldemort." "Look all you like," Harry said. "You've seen it before. You saw it over a wand in Godric's Hollow the night your curse turned on you, and you've been carrying a piece of it in my forehead ever since. You just never understood what you were looking at." He did not raise the fang. He did not need to yet. "I told you the truth through the link, and you've come all this way to prove I was lying. So go on, reach for the anchors, reach for the stone, reach for any of it right now while I watch. Tell me you still feel them." The thing in Quirrell went still, and Harry watched it reach, watched the ruined face slacken as the Wraith cast its awareness out along the threads that had hummed with its own immortality for a decade, and watched with the cold attention of a man confirming a kill the exact moment it found nothing there. No diary, no ring, no cup, no locket, no diadem. Only silence and one last thread, thin and hot, running to the fragment behind a child's scar, the final anchor left in all the world, lodged in the skull of the child standing in front of it holding a basilisk fang. "Impossible," Voldemort breathed through the ruined mouth, and for the first time the high cold voice had a crack running through it. "They cannot all be gone. They were hidden. They were hidden where no living soul could find them, by charms and curses and secrets that died with the men who kept them. A cave no one could enter, a vault no one could open, a room no one knew existed. You are a child. You cannot have walked the road it took me a lifetime to build. You are lying to me. You are a boy telling a story in the dark. I opened the cave with a house elf your servant left to die in it," Harry said, level, unhurried, laying it out as he had laid everything out all year in checkable pieces. "I opened the vault with the goblins who never once cared what you were, only that you'd made a fool of their bank. I opened the room by walking to the wall and asking. The diary your servant kept in a drawer. The ring in your grandfather's shack under the floor where you murdered your own father. I've been to all of them, and I brought the Founder's serpent's tooth to every one, and I watched every piece of you scream and come apart. The only reason you can't feel the truth of it is that your whole soul is built to refuse the one fact it can't survive, that you were never the only clever person in the world. You only ever met people too cowed to prove it." He let the fang catch the blue light. "I didn't flinch. I'd already watched you win once, and I came back to make sure you never do it again. There is nothing of you left in all the world, Tom, except the scrap on the back of that dying man's skull and the scrap behind my scar, and after tonight there will be nothing at all." The Wraith understood. Harry saw it understand, and it did the thing he had built the whole trap to make it do. "Then I will take back what is mine," Voldemort said through Quirrell's mouth, and drove the dying man forward across the wet stone to seize the child and tear the last piece of himself out of Harry's living skull. Quirrell's hands closed on Harry's arms, and the protection his mother had died to lay on him woke like a struck match. Harry had counted on it, and it still nearly took him off his feet, the raw old magic of it, the sacrifice of a woman 10 years dead flaring up through her son's skin at the touch of the thing that had killed her. Where Quirrell's fingers gripped him, the professor's flesh blistered and blackened and began to burn, not with fire but with something worse, an unmaking, the man's hands crumbling to gray ash even as they clutched, and Quirrell screamed, and the Wraith screamed with him through the ruined mouth, and still Harry did not pull away. This was the hinge of the whole plan, and it turned on him, holding on while a man burned to nothing in his grip. He held on. He did not tell himself the man was already gone, though it was true. The wraith had drunk Quirrell Hollow across a year, and there had been nothing much left of the stammering professor for months. He did not tell himself it was mercy, though it was that too, an ending to a possession that would only have gone on hollowing the man until he dropped. He told himself the truth, which was that this was the cost, that winning had a price and the price was standing here in the dark with his hands full of another person's ending and not letting go, and that a man who wanted the clean version of victory, the version with no ash on his hands, was a man who lost to people willing to pay what he would not. Harry had lost once to exactly such people. He did not intend to lose again for want of the stomach for it. He held on and he kept his eyes open, and he looked into the dying host's stolen gaze and he found, behind it, the wraith itself, cornered, screaming, its host crumbling out from under it, nowhere left in all the world to go. Nowhere except one place, one last anchor, one thread still open because Harry had opened it himself and left it open, a door standing wide in the dark. "Come on then," Harry said very quietly as Quirrell's body came apart into ash and gray ruin between his hands. "You've got one anchor left and it's in my head, come and take it." The wraith took the door. It abandoned the crumbling corpse and poured itself along the last hot thread and into Harry through the scar in a torrent of black cold. And it was exactly as terrible as he remembered from the first life. The sensation of another mind flooding into your own. A will vast and ancient and utterly without mercy filling the rooms of you and reaching for the controls. And for one endless instant Harry Potter stood in the Chamber of Secrets with the greatest dark wizard in a century pouring himself into the child's body, meaning to wear it out into the world and begin again. That was the moment Harry had planned for. That was the whole of it, the single point on which the second life turned. Because the wraith entering did not enter a helpless child. It entered a war. Harry did not fight the possession as he had fought it as a child, thrashing, clawing, trying to force the thing out. He did the opposite. He let it come all the way in, every last cold thread of it, and then he closed the door behind it. He shut the scar. He sealed the wraith inside the one place it could not survive, because there were two things in Harry's mind that the maker of Horcruxes had spent a lifetime tearing out of his own soul, and could not now endure the nearness of, and the wraith had just swum straight into the heart of both. The first was the fragment. The sliver of Voldemort that had lived behind Harry's scar for 10 years rose up to meet the flood of its own greater self. And for one impossible instant the two pieces of the same torn soul recognized each other and reached to become whole again. And in reaching they became, both of them, a single distinct thing inside Harry's mind, no longer diffused through his flesh but gathered into one place, one shape, one soul mass, exposed entire. And separate from Harry's own self for the first time in a decade. It was the boil brought to a head. It was the enemy, all of the enemy that remained in all the world, poured into one vessel and gathered into one target, and Harry stood over it in the vast cathedral of his own mind with the whole force of his war-hardened will and did not hesitate. They met in that place as two architectures of a single ruined thing. Harry had been inside Voldemort's mind before in the first life, dragged there against his will, and he knew its shape. A vast cold palace of appetite with every window bricked over, room after room of stolen power and no door that opened outward. A place built by someone who had mistaken the walling off of the world for strength. Now the enemy stood inside Harry's mind instead, and found not a child's small unfinished house but something the maker had no category for, a fortress raised over the foundation of a life already lived and lost, its walls the discipline of a soldier, its keep the cold clear war room where Harry did his thinking, and beneath all of it in the deep places a thing the palace of appetite had never once contained, doors that opened outward. The wraith turned in the great dark of that mind looking for the controls, for the levers of the body, for the soft yielding child it had expected to wear, and found instead that it had walked willingly into a trap laid by a mind older and harder and stranger than its own, and that the door it had come in by was already shut behind it, and that the walls of the room it stood in were beginning very quietly to close. Harry held it there. It cost him everything the body had and more, the child's small store of magic burning down to its last reserve, his nose running blood, his knees gone from under him on the wet stone of the chamber, while in the cathedral of his mind he pinned the gathered soul of Lord Voldemort in place and would not let it spread. This was the heartbeat he had built the whole plan around, the one instant in which the enemy was condensed and separate and cornered, and it lasted no longer than a heartbeat lasts, and a heartbeat was all he needed because he had spent the spring making sure he would know exactly what to do with it. The second thing was the one the maker had never understood, and it was the killing thing. Harry opened at the center of himself the door he kept shut against everyone, the small cellar where he had put down the stone he carried, and he let the wraith see what lived there. Not weakness, not softness, the dead. Everyone he had lost in the first life and everyone he had lost before it began. His mother's face he had only ever seen in a photograph, and his father's laugh he had never heard in Sirius falling through a veil, and 100 more. The whole weight of everything he had lost and never set down, that had survived a war and survived death and survived being reborn into a child's body too small to hold it. All of it undiminished, unkilled. The one thing in Harry the second life had never managed to make cold. He had carried it the whole year like a passenger he would not let take the wheel. Now he took it up in both hands and he turned it on the enemy like a weapon, because to a soul that had torn every human bond out of itself to cheat death, the undiluted presence of that much love was not a comfort. It was acid, it was fire. It was the one country the Wraith could not survive setting foot in. The Wraith, gathered into a single soul mass inside Harry's mind, immersed in the one thing it had made itself unable to bear, began to come apart. And that was when the song began. It came from far above, down the mile of pipe, through the sealed stone, a single thread of music impossibly sweet, and under the sweetness a note of such loss that it stopped the breath, and Harry knew it, and the sound of it in the drowned dark was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing he had ever heard. Fox. The phoenix, drawn to the confrontation the way phoenixes were drawn to the great turnings of the world, sang into the chamber of secrets, and the song was not for the Wraith. The song was for Harry. It poured down through the stone and into the burning cathedral of his mind, and it did the thing Phoenix song did, which was to give strength to the pure of heart and undoing to the impure, and it wrapped itself around Harry's will like a hand around a failing hand, and it held him up while he did the thing that would have killed him to do alone. He drove the gathered soul mass out. He took the enemy, all of it, the flooding Wraith and the risen fragment fused now into one exposed and burning thing, and with the whole force of his will and the weapon he had made of his own unkilled heart and the Phoenix song bearing him up, he expelled it, forced it back along the thread it had come in by, out through the scar, out of the vessel it had thought to steal. Into the cold air of the chamber, where it had nothing left to anchor to, and no immortality to fall back on, and no host to flee into, and nothing human to shelter in. It came out of him in a scream that shook the black water and brought dust sifting down from the roof, a scream of the last of Lord Voldemort understanding, finally and forever, that death had come for him after all, that all his tearing and hiding and murdering had bought him nothing but a longer road to the same door. There was in that scream at the very end, under the outrage and the denial, a note Harry had not expected and would not forget. The thin high cry of the unwanted child who had started all of it, the orphan who had decided the world was a thing to be conquered because it had never once been a thing that held him, meeting at last the ending he had murdered 6 times to escape, and finding it exactly as cold and exactly as lonely as everything else in his long, cold life. Harry did not soften toward it. He had walked too far past that door for it to open now. But he heard it and he understood it, because he alone in all the world had seen where the monster came from, and the understanding did not stay his hand by so much as a breath. The soul mass hung in the Founder's stone shadow for one instant, formless, screaming, burning in the Phoenix song, and in the fire of everything Harry had refused to let go cold. Then it guttered and thinned and went out the way a candle goes out, one small fire in a cathedral, and was gone. The chamber was silent. Harry stood alone on the wet stone with gray ash at his feet where a man had been, and no more heat in his scar, none, for the first time in a life he could remember, only a clean, cool absence where the enemy had lived for 10 years, and above him the Phoenix song faded into the pipe in a way, its work done. He put a hand to his forehead. The scar was there, a thin old line of it, but it was quiet, and it was only a scar now, a mark left by a wound that had finally fully closed. For 10 years in 2 lives he had shared the rooms of his own skull with a lodger. He had never known it as a boy the first time. He had thought the flashes of a cruelty that was not his, the dreams that were not dreams, the strange pull toward the dark tongue of serpents were simply parts of himself, and only later had he learned that a piece of his enemy had been sitting behind his eyes the whole while, reading his sight, listening at his thoughts, waiting. Now the lodger was gone, and the silence it left behind was enormous. His thoughts were only his thoughts. Whatever moved in him from this night forward would move at his own bidding and no one else's. The pull toward the dark places was gone, and the parcel tongue with it, he could tell already, the borrowed language draining out of him with the borrowed soul. He was, for the first time since he was 1 year old, a single undivided person, and the strangeness of that was its own kind of vertigo, a man who has carried a stone so long he has forgotten the shape of walking without it, taking his first steps in the sudden lightness and not quite trusting the ground. He had won the war he came back to win. He had also quietly in the dark won a smaller and more private freedom that no one else in the world would ever know he had needed, and he stood in the emptied chamber and let himself have the fact of it for exactly 1 breath before he put it 2 down where he put everything. He had done it. The fragment was gone and the Wraith was gone, and there was not, anywhere in the world, 1 thread of Lord Voldemort's soul left to hide in an object or flee into a snake or ride on the back of another fool's head. The immortality the enemy had murdered 6 times to build was undone entire. And the man who had built it was, at last and for good, simply dead, and the war that had eaten Harry's whole first life had been strangled so completely in its cradle that most of the people it would have killed would live their lives and never know how close the dark had come, or that a child had stood between them and it, alone in the dark, and won. There was still work to do, and Harry did it before he let himself rest, because a victory you could not explain was a victory that made you the prime suspect, and the whole architecture of the second life depended on no one ever knowing what the quiet Slytherin boy had done in the deep places of the school. Quirinus Quirrell had vanished. His rooms would be found empty in the morning, his belongings gone with him. A professor who had spent the year growing stranger and thinner, who had lied about his travels and worn garlic against imaginary vampires and flinched from his own shadow, was exactly the sort of man the world would assume had simply cracked and fled, and Harry intended to give that assumption nothing to trip over. He gathered what the protection had left of the man, and he gave the gray remains to the one thing in the chamber that could be trusted to keep a secret, the deep black water between the columns, and he watched it close over the last of Quirinus Quirrell without a ripple. He sealed the founder's mouth on the basilisk's bones in his own night's work. He would let the castle believe its defense professor had abandoned his post, and the ministry believe the Dark Lord's shade had never come closer than a rumor, and the whole world go on exactly as it had, never knowing that the war it had been sleepwalking toward had ended tonight, in the dark, a mile beneath the mountains, and been buried with the man it had ridden in on. Only when it was done did he sit down on the wet stone, because the body had reached the far end of what it could give, and he let it shake, and he did not stop it, because there was no one to see, and because even a general was allowed once at the end of a war to feel the size of the thing he had carried. The one thing he permitted himself he did not say aloud, and did not name even inside his own skull. He only let it move through him once in the silence under the graven face of the founder, with the ash of his enemy cooling at his feet and the deep quiet of the emptied chamber closing over him like water. Then he put it down as he put everything down, and he began to think about what came next, because the enemy was dead, and that was the war he had come back to win. But there was still one man in the castle overhead who had spent a century learning to be the most powerful person in every room, and who had watched a child dismantle a Dark Lord without ever once being allowed to see how, and Albus Dumbledore box him as cleverly as Harry had, was not a piece you left standing on the board with your back turned. The last confrontation of the Second Life was not with a wraith. It was with a tired old man who cared for the world too much to be trusted with it, and Harry climbed back up the pipe toward the sleeping castle in the gray before dawn to go and settle, once and for all, the question of who would build the world that came after the war that now would never be. He came up into the abandoned bathroom as the first light grayed the high windows, and he was soaked and ash-streaked and hollow in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness, hollowed of the passenger he had carried since he was 1 year old, and he stood a moment among the grimy sinks and felt the strange new lightness of a mind that was, for the first time in either life, entirely and only his own. Then Fawkes came down through the broken window in a wash of red and gold, and settled on a cracked basin and looked at him with ancient knowing eyes, and Harry understood that the phoenix had not come only for him, and that the bird's true master would know by morning that his familiar had gone into the deep places of the school to sing for a child, and would draw from that the only conclusion left to draw. Because Fawkes came to greatness of heart and fled from the dark always without exception, it was the whole nature of the creature. And Fawkes had come down a mile of pipe into the oldest evil in Britain to sing for Harry Potter, and against the thing Harry was destroying had lent its strength to first-year Slytherin in the deepest secret place of the school, and there was only one man in the world the phoenix would tell of that, and only one thing that man could conclude from it. That whatever the quiet, strange child in green had been doing all year, whatever hand had moved diaries and vaults and prisoners and ministers across the board, it was a hand the phoenix had judged worthy of its song. Dumbledore had spent the year unable to decide whether the thing moving through his school was a threat to be stopped or a gift to be trusted. His own familiar had just decided for him. And Harry, who had planned the whole confrontation with the wraith down to the width of a heartbeat, had not planned the phoenix, had not summoned it, had not known for certain it would come. And standing now in the gray dawn with the great red bird regarding him, he understood that the last and most powerful witness in Britain had rendered its verdict on him unasked, and that the verdict was going to matter very much in the room at the top of the moving stair before this day was out. "You'll tell him, I suppose," Harry said to the phoenix. "You'll tell him, I suppose," Harry said to the phoenix, and reached out and touched the warm feathers, and the bird did not pull away. "Go on then, tell him it's finished. Tell him the thing he built his whole life around dying for is dead, and I'm not, and the war he was saving the world for isn't coming." He looked into the black knowing eyes. "And tell him I'll see him tonight. He'll want to know how it ends between us, and so do I." Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The architect of a new order, the castle, woke to the news that Professor Quirrell had vanished in the night, and by breakfast the story had already found the shape it would keep. A jittery man worn thin by a hard year had abandoned his post and fled, leaving an empty office and a faint reek of garlic and no forwarding address. The staff table wore its concern like a borrowed coat. The students speculated and forgot, and Harry Potter ate his porridge among the Slytherins with the deep quiet of the emptied chamber still in him, and waited for the summons he had told a phoenix to deliver, because the war was won and only the peace remained to be settled, and the peace, as always, was the harder half. It was a strange thing to have killed the nightmare of 2 lifetimes and to be sitting, hours later, at a house table under an enchanted ceiling, being handed a jug of pumpkin juice by a fourth-year prefect who thought him nothing more remarkable than an unusually quiet child. No one at the table knew. No one in the hall knew. The whole vast machinery of the wizarding world had slept through its own salvation and would go on sleeping, and Harry found he preferred it that way, because a world that knew what he had done was a world that would want to reward him or shrink from him or use him, and he had no use for any of the three. The body, at least, knew what the night had cost. It was heavy this morning, wrung out to its last thread, aching in the deep way that told him he had spent nearly all the raw magic a child's frame could hold. He ate slowly and let it recover. There was one more thing to do before he could rest, and it was not a thing that could be done tired, because the man he was going to see could read the state of you off the set of your shoulders and the pace of your blood, and Harry intended to walk into that tower looking like exactly what the world believed him to be and nothing more. He had thought for a long time about what he wanted from Albus Dumbledore. Killing him had never been on the table. A dead Dumbledore was a martyr, an earthquake, a hole in the center of the world that 100 lesser men would rush to fill, and half of them would be worse. Exposing him was a weapon Harry would keep in reserve and did not expect ever to need. What Harry wanted was subtler and more total than either, and it was the one thing the old man had never once in a century been asked to give, not his death, not his help, but his surrender. His agreement to stand aside. His blessing on a world he had spent his life trying to save the hard way, handed to a child who had saved it the impossible way instead. It came at mid-morning, carried by a first-year Ravenclaw with a note in green ink. The headmaster would welcome Mr. Potter's company. Harry folded the note and finished his tea and did not hurry, because a man who runs to a meeting has already told the other man who holds the whip, and Harry had spent a whole year making certain the whip was his. The gargoyle stood aside without a password. That in itself was a message. The old man was done pretending there were doors between them. Harry rode the moving stair up into the round tower office where he had laid the truth on the desk in April, and he found it changed only in one particular. The silver instrument still turned and puffed, the portrait still feigned sleep. But the case that had held the sword of Godric Gryffindor stood open and empty on the wall, and Harry understood at a glance what the old man had done and why, and something in him that was not quite admiration acknowledged the move. "You gave the sword to the goblins," Harry said as the door closed behind him, "or offered it a gesture. You worked out that I'd promised them something, and you decided to be seen giving them a thing they've wanted back for 5 centuries before I could be the one to give it to them." He took the chair across the desk without waiting to be asked. "It won't work, headmaster. They'll take the sword and thank you and go on owing me because I offered first and I offered without being cornered into it. But it was well played. You're still the second cleverest man in Britain." Albus Dumbledore sat behind his desk with his long hands folded and his half-moon glasses catching the morning light, and he looked at the child in Slytherin green for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice had lost the last of its comfortable music and found instead something Harry had waited 2 lifetimes to hear in it, the plain tiredness of a man who has stopped playing. "Fawkes came to me at dawn," Dumbledore said. "He was in the Chamber of Secrets. I did not know it had been opened. He sang there for someone against something in the deepest and darkest place under this school, and he came back to me changed as he is changed only by the very greatest turnings of the world." The blue eyes rested on Harry, ancient and grave. "My familiar has bonded himself to you, Harry. In 50 years he has done that to no one but me. So I find I must ask you the question I have been asking all year, and this time I must have an answer because I no longer have the luxury of pretending I do not need one. What did you do last night? And what, in the name of everything I have spent my life protecting, are you?" Harry looked at the old man across the desk, and he made the last great decision of the second life, which was how much of the truth to give and to whom, and he decided for once to give nearly all of it, because the man in front of him had earned it and because a checkmate is only complete when your opponent can see the whole board. "Last night I killed Voldemort," Harry said simply. "Not his body, he hasn't had one in 10 years, him, all of him. The wraith that was riding Quirrell, and the last piece of his soul that's been living behind my scar since the night he tried to murder me in my cot. I drew the wraith into me through the scar and I destroyed it and the fragment together, and Fawkes came and sang so that it wouldn't kill me to do it, and now there's not one thread of that man left anywhere in the world, in an object or a snake or a shade in a forest. The war you have spent your whole life preparing to fight is over, headmaster. It ended in the dark under your school and no one will ever know it was fought, and that is exactly how I want it." The old man had gone very still. "The prophecy," he whispered. "It said neither can live while the other survives. It said you would have to. It said I'd have to face him, and I did, and I won, and the prophecy is spent," Harry said. "You built your whole plan on the narrowest reading of it, the one where the only way the fragment died was if I died with it. There was another way. There was always another way. You couldn't see it because you decided long ago that the answer had to be a sacrifice, because sacrifice is the only shape of victory a man carries who has spent 100 years believing he doesn't deserve the win." Harry let that sit and watched it land, and then he reached across the desk and turned the last card face up. "I know why you believe that, headmaster. I know about Grindelwald. I know about the summer in Godric's Hollow, and the plans the two of you made for a world ruled by wizards for its own good, and I know about the duel between the 3 of you, and I know it was your sister Ariana who died in it, and I know you have never once let yourself be certain whose curse it was that killed her. I know you have spent the century since flinching from your own power, because the last time you reached for it a child died, and I know that is the real reason you were always going to send me into that forest instead of going yourself. You don't trust yourself with the world. So you decided to save it by giving it away, one careful sacrifice at a time, and you were going to make me the last of them." Silence filled the round office, deep and absolute, and Albus Dumbledore, who had not been laid bare by any living soul in 100 years, sat in the wreckage of every secret he had ever kept and looked at the child who had recited them back to him like a shopping list, and the ancient face did a thing Harry had never seen it do in either life. It crumpled briefly into something very old and very tired and almost at the last relieved, the face of a man who has carried a stone so long that even the taking of it by force by a stranger feels a little like being set down. No one alive knows those things, Dumbledore said at last hoarsely. Not all of them, not Ariana, not the whole of it. I have never told a soul. You told one soul, Harry said. You told me in a life you don't remember, at the very end of everything, when we were both about to die and you thought it no longer mattered who knew. You wept when you told me. You said you had been the one to blame, that your hunger for power had cost you your sister, and that you had spent the rest of your life keeping yourself as far from power as a man of your gifts could stand, taking the schoolteacher's post instead of the minister's chair, refusing the things you could so easily have had, because you did not trust the youth who had wanted to rule the world not to want it again. He watched the old man absorb the impossible intimacy of it, the fact that a child was quoting his deathbed confession back to him decades before he would have made it. So I know it isn't cruelty in you, headmaster. I've never once thought it cruelty. It's 100 years of penance. But penance made you slow, and slowness costs lives, and you were about to make my death the last and largest payment on a debt that was never mine to settle. I'm here to tell you the debt is closed. The war you were paying it down against is over. You can stop now. That is not a threat. That, believe it or not, is the kindest thing anyone has said to you in a very long time. Something broke very quietly behind the ancient blue eyes, and it was not defeat, though it wore defeat's face. It was the particular unclenching of a man who has been braced against a blow for so long that he has forgotten his shoulders can come down, being told gently by the one person who could not be lying that the blow is never going to fall. I know, Harry said, and I'm never going to tell one either, and that's the offer, headmaster, so listen closely because I'm only going to make it once. I could destroy you. I have in my hands right now enough of your history to end you, to turn the man the whole world worships into the youth who dreamed of ruling muggles and got his sister killed reaching for it. I could hand it to Rita Skeeter and watch a century of reputation burn in a fortnight. I'm not going to. Not because I'm kind, though I'm kinder than you'd expect, but because a Britain that loses its faith in Albus Dumbledore all at once is a Britain that comes apart, and I've just spent a year making sure this country never has to come apart again. I want you alive, I want you respected. I want you exactly where you are, the beloved old lion in his tower, right up until the day you decide to retire to somewhere warm and write your memoirs and leave the difficult work to people who are actually good at it. He held the blue eyes. What I want in return is simple, your silence and your stillness and your blessing on a world you're going to watch me build and are never ever going to try to stop me building. Give me that and your secrets die with me. Refuse and we find out which of us the country believes. I already know the answer, I think you do too. For a long moment the greatest wizard of the age did not speak, and the instruments turned, and Fawkes watched from his perch with his ancient knowing eyes, and Harry waited with the patience of a man who has already won and is merely allowing his opponent the dignity of seeing it for himself. Then Dumbledore did the thing Harry had half expected and wholly prepared for. He reached slowly for the wand lying on the desk at his right hand. He did not reach for it as a threat. Harry saw that at once. There was no violence in the movement, only the old reflex of a cornered lion, the instinct of a man who has faced down dark lords and ministries and death itself to close his fingers around the one thing that has never failed him. And Harry, who had planned this moment down to the breath, who had known since the summer that the last piece of the board was a length of elder wood with a core of the straw hair, did the single most important thing he would do in the whole of the second life, and did it in the time it takes to say one word. Expelliarmus, Harry said quietly, and the holly wand in his small hand flashed, and the elder wand leapt out of Albus Dumbledore's fingers and spun across the round office and slapped into Harry's waiting palm. The room went very quiet. It was not a duel, and it had not been a fight. It had been a disarming, clean and complete, the single spell the whole wizarding world dismissed as a child's defense, and it had done the one thing in all the world that mattered, because the elder wand did not care how it changed hands, only that it did. It answered strength and cunning and the winning of it, and a first year had just won it out of the hand of the only master it had known for half a century, in the master's own tower with the master's own familiar looking on, and Harry felt the allegiance turn to him the way you feel a key finally seat in a lock, a deep silent click somewhere beneath the world. He looked down at the two wands in his hands, the holly that had chosen him and the elder that he had taken, and he understood exactly what he now held, and the understanding did not go to his head, because his head had been filled for 2 lifetimes with the knowledge of what happened to men who led it. Dumbledore made no move to reclaim the wand. He sat very still behind the desk, an old man who had just been disarmed by a first year in his own tower and had felt, as surely as Harry had, the deep silent turning of a loyalty that had answered to him for 50 years, and there was on his face not outrage but something closer to recognition, the look of a man watching a prophecy he had never quite believed in come true in front of him in the plainest possible way. He had spent his life wary of the elder wand, wary of what it woke in men, wary most of all of what it might wake in himself. He had kept it locked in a discipline of refusal, using its power for nothing greater than the ordinary work of a headmaster, because he did not trust the youth of Godric's Hollow with a weapon that had toppled kings. And now it had passed in the space of one word to a child who wanted nothing from it, and Harry watched the old man understand that this, precisely this, was the only safe hand the wand could ever have fallen into, and watched something in him let go of a weight he had carried since before Harry's grandparents were born. "You have the cloak," Dumbledore said, very softly, watching him. "Your father's. I returned it to you at Christmas. And the ring, the gaunt ring, you said you destroyed the fragment in it, which means you have the stone, and now the wand." The old man's voice was hushed, and under the hush ran a thread of warning. "You have gathered the Deathly Hallows, Harry, all three. You are, by every legend this world has ever told, the Master of Death." "I have three very dangerous objects," Harry said, "and I know exactly what each of them is worth, which is more than the legend does and more than you did." He slid the Elder Wand away into his robes, out of sight where it would stay. "I'm not going to wear the ring and go mad turning the stone to talk to the dead, the way you nearly did. I'm not going to wave the Elder Wand around and spend the rest of my life fighting off every fool who wants to take it from me. No one is ever going to know I hold it, and a wand no one knows you have is a wand no one comes for. And I'm not going to tell myself I've conquered death, because I haven't, and the men who believe they have are exactly the men I've spent a year putting in the ground. I'm not the Master of Death, Headmaster. I'm just the first person to hold all three of these and not want anything from them badly enough to be destroyed by it. That's the whole trick the tale never tells. The Hallows don't make you a master. They just find out very quickly whether you already are one." He rose from the chair, and he stood in the morning light of the round office with a Dark Lord's death and a headmaster's secrets, and the three oldest objects in the wizarding world all held quietly in the hands of a child. And Albus Dumbledore looked up at him from behind the desk, with the expression of a man watching the world he thought he understood rearrange itself into a shape he had never imagined and could not now prevent. "Who are you?" the old man said one last time, not as an interrogation now, but almost as a prayer. Harry considered the question and considered the two lives that answered it and gave the truest reply he had. "I'm the child you were going to sacrifice," he said. "I lived the whole war you were preparing me for. I watched everyone die, and I died myself, and I lost, and then I woke up 11 years old with all of it still in my head and one chance to do it differently, so I did. I moved first. I unmade him before he could rise, and I took the board apart before the game began, and I did it all before my 12th birthday, and the only person on earth who will ever know is you." He looked down at the tired old man with something that was not unkind. "You spent 100 years believing the world could only be saved by someone willing to die for it. I'm the proof that it could be saved by someone determined to live and to win and to build something better out of the wreckage before the wreckage ever happened. Rest now, Headmaster, you've earned it. The war's not coming. I made sure of that. Let me carry the rest." Dumbledore was quiet for a long time, and then slowly the old man inclined his silver head, and in the gesture was the whole of a surrender that was also, somewhere underneath, a benediction, the passing of a torch from a man who had carried it too long and too fearfully to a successor he could not have chosen and could not now refuse. "I believe," he said, "that I have spent my life being wrong about the shape of courage. Thank you, Harry, for showing me the other kind before the end." He almost smiled. "What will you build?" "Something that lasts," Harry said. "Come and see." And Dumbledore did. That was the strange and quiet grace of the years that followed. The old man kept the accord to the letter, and more than the letter. He stood aside and held his silence and let the child build, and where once he would have watched Harry with the wary calculation of a chess master tracking a threat, he came instead to watch him with the settled attention of a teacher who has been surprised, late in a long life, by a pupil who has learned the lesson the teacher never quite managed himself. They spoke sometimes in the tower over a game and a dish of sherbet lemons, an old man and a boy who was not a boy, the last two people in Britain who knew what had truly happened in the dark beneath the school, and there was in those conversations, for both of them, something neither had expected the accord to hold. Not the wariness of a truce, but the odd companionable quiet of two soldiers from different wars who have finally found the one other person who understands the weight of the pack. Dumbledore lived a long time yet and died at last in his bed, old and unshaken, his reputation whole, his secrets safe, his world saved by the very kind of courage he had spent a century failing to imagine. Harry was there at the end. He owed the old man that much and paid it willingly and told no one. The new order did not arrive with trumpets. That was the first principle of it, and the deepest, because Harry had watched in his first life what became of orders that arrived with trumpets. They made enemies of everyone the trumpets woke, and they fell as loudly as they had risen. His would come the way weather comes, in 100 small changes that no one could point to and no one could resist, until one day the world looked up and found itself somewhere new and could not say when the road had turned. He had a model for it, and the model was Voldemort, studied in reverse. The Dark Lord had tried to remake the world by force, by making himself the loudest and most menacing thing in every room, and it had failed twice because cruelty breeds resistance the way damp breeds mold, and every atrocity had recruited a new enemy, and in the end the whole edifice of it had collapsed on the single point of a child who would not stop standing up. Harry had learned the lesson written in that failure and inverted it whole. Where Voldemort had forced the world to look at him, Harry would make certain it never once looked his way. Where Voldemort had torn the world apart to reshape it, Harry would let it reshape itself along channels he had quietly dug in advance, so that men congratulated themselves on choices he had made for them a year before they knew there was a choice to make. Where Voldemort had wanted above all to be known as the Master, Harry wanted, above all, never to be suspected of being anything at all. It was the difference between a conqueror and an architect, and Harry had spent one lifetime being conquered and did not intend to spend this one being a conqueror. He intended to build. Sirius was the visible face of it, and Harry spent him carefully. Lord Black took his ancient seat at the center of the Wisengamot and became, over that summer and the years that followed, the reforming conscience of magical Britain, the rehabilitated hero who had suffered the Ministry's worst injustice and emerged asking reasonably, gravely, whether a country that could imprison an innocent man for 12 years without trial might not need to look hard at how it did everything else. No one could refuse Sirius Black a hearing. The guilt of the whole establishment guaranteed it. And behind every reasonable question Sirius asked in that chamber stood a boy in a dormitory who had drafted it, and behind every vote that answered stood a web of debts and leverages and quiet understandings that Harry had spent a year weaving and would spend a lifetime tending. The Ministry began to change. The oversight of executors first, so that no other orphan would ever again be raised in a cupboard, while a great man held his fortune in trust. Then the review of the wartime convictions, which quietly freed 2 more innocents and quietly ended 3 careers of men who had signed away lives to save themselves paperwork. Then more slowly, the harder things, the ancient cruelties woven so deep into the wizarding world that most wizards had stopped seeing them as cruelties at all. The laws that made goblins less than persons, the enchantments that bound house elves into slavery, the long-settled disregard for every magical people that was not human and every human that was not pure. Harry did not tear these down. Tearing down made martyrs of the old order and heroes of the resentful. He undermined them instead, one precedent at a time, one sympathetic case at a time, a goblin's property claim upheld here, a freed elf's testimony admitted there, until the foundations that had held the old cruelty in place had rotted so thoroughly that when it finally fell, it fell of its own weight, and the men who had defended it could not for the life of them remember why they had. The goblins kept their word, and Harry kept his, and the sword of Godric Gryffindor was only the first of the treasures that went home to the forges that had made them. Returned not by force, but by a slow changing of the law that a boy had set in motion, and a goblin nation would remember for 1,000 years. Ragnarok's bank found itself, for the first time in 5 centuries, dealing with a wizard it did not have to watch, and the scarred old cursebreaker who had returned a fang with a bow told the story of the small speaker who came wanting to owe them until it became, among the goblins, something very close to a legend, and the legend was worth more to Harry than any vault. Snape kept his post and his secrets in his impossible divided heart, and served Harry as he had served a dead woman's memory faithfully and bitterly and well, and found over the years that serving the living son who had avenged her was a lighter thing to carry than serving the ghost had ever been, though he would have died before admitting it. Dobby and Creature tended the web of the household and the whispers of the powerful, free, and devoted, the 2 most underestimated creatures in Britain in the service of the one wizard who had never once underestimated them. And Lucius Malfoy went on gleaming at his galas and moving his votes, a serpent who had convinced himself, exactly as Harry had promised, that he had chosen his own leash, and who served the new order faithfully out of a self-interest so total that it had become, in the end, indistinguishable from loyalty. The other servants of the old dark Harry dealt with the way a careful gardener deals with the roots that could sprout again. He did not hunt them, hunting made legends and martyrs, and a martyr was a seed. He simply made certain quietly through Pettigrew's Veritasrum testimony and the reopened wartime files and 100 documents the goblins helped him assemble, that the men who had once worn the mark spent the rest of their lives too watched and too compromised and too comfortable to ever again risk what they had. The ones who might have gathered around a returning Dark Lord found that there was no Dark Lord returning, and never would be, and that the cause they had bled for had died so quietly they could not even bury it properly, and one by one they made their peace with the small safe lives that were the only lives left to them. Bellatrix Lestrange stayed in her cell in Azkaban, and the vault that had held the cup held only gold now, and there was no one left in all the world to come and break her out for a war that was never going to happen. The embers of the first life's fire Harry banked and buried and watered down one by one, until there was nothing left of the thing that had burned the world but a cold hearth, and a story the survivors would tell their children about a darkness that had passed them by, closer than they ever knew. There were the friends, too, the ones he had counted as his own in the first life and could not be a child beside in this one. Harry watched over them from a careful distance. Ron Weasley grew up whole and unbetrayed with all his brothers living, and never knew that the strange, quiet Slytherin who had once stood beside him on a bridge and helped him throw stones into the dark had rewritten the whole of his family's fate. Hermione Granger became, as she was always going to become, the brightest witch of her age, and Harry made certain the doors that had been shut to her for the accident of her birth were, one by one, quietly opened, and she never knew whose hand had opened them. Ginny grew up laughing, unhaunted by a diary that had burned on a chamber floor before it could ever touch her. Neville's parents, whom the war would have broken, were never broken. 100 deaths that the first life had spent so freely simply never happened, and the people who owed their lives to a child's foreknowledge lived them out in an ordinary, unremarkable peace they would never think to question, which was, Harry had decided long ago, the truest measure of a victory, not the monument, but the absence of the grave. There was a day some years on that he kept for himself the way a miser keeps a coin. It was the afternoon the Wisengamot voted, at long and gradual last, to strike the enchantments that had bound the house elves for 1,000 years, and to write into the law of magical Britain that no thinking creature could be owned. Lord Black rose to speak for it, grey now at the temples and sober and beloved, and he made the case with a plain force that carried the chamber, and no one who watched him knew that the words he spoke had been shaped 3 nights before across a chessboard in a study in London by a young man who never once appeared in the public record of the thing. When the vote came, it was not close. And in the visitors' gallery, unremarked, a slight dark figure watched an ancient cruelty end without a single drop of blood spilled to end it, and thought of a house elf weeping over a broken locket on a kitchen floor and of another clutching a single sock beside a black lake, and permitted himself nothing at all on his face because the face was part of the work and the work was never finished. But he remembered it. Of all the things he built, he remembered that one. He grew, over the years, into the man the first life had never let him become. The body caught up to the mind at last slowly, and there was a strange gentleness in that, in feeling the old war-hardened self and the young unmarked one finally arrive in the same place at the same age, so that by the time he was truly grown he was, for the first time simply and wholly himself, neither a general trapped in a nursery nor a boy pretending to a wisdom he had not earned, but a man who had earned all of it twice. He never took a public office. That was the last and deepest principle of the new order, that the surest throne is the one no one knows is occupied, and that a man who needs the crown to feel like a king was never really either. He moved the world from a study and a Wisengamot proxy and a web of debts and 1,000 quiet dinners, and the world grew kinder and fairer and safer by his design, and gave the credit to 100 other names exactly as he intended, because the credit was the one thing he had never wanted. Historians of that age, when it was finally over and they came to write it, would find a curious thing. They would find a generation of reform without a reformer, a slow, bloodless revolution in the laws and habits of magical Britain that seemed to have no single author, only a great many reasonable people arriving, one after another, at reasonable conclusions, until a cruel and narrow world had somehow become a fairer and braver one, and no one could quite say who had first pushed the stone. They would note, if they were sharp, that a certain quiet man of the Potter line had known most of those reasonable people, and been present at the edges of most of those conclusions, and profited from none of them. And they would decide, because it was the only sensible thing to decide, that he had merely been lucky in his friends and his times. That was the epitaph Harry wanted, and the only monument he would ever accept, a better world and no name on it, and a mystery at the center that the clever would circle forever and never solve. He had been a legend once, the boy who lived, and the legend had nearly killed him, because a legend is a thing the world does to you rather than a thing you do to the world. This time he would be a rumor instead, and a rumor, he had learned, was so much stronger because you could not martyr a rumor or worship it or corner it in a graveyard and make it die for you. You could only wonder about it and go on living the good life it had quietly arranged and never know. All of that lay ahead in the years the second life would give him. But it began, all of it, on a single evening at the end of a single stolen year, and it was to that evening that Harry always returned in his mind ever after as the true hinge of both his lives. On the last evening of that first year, before the train carried the school home for summer that would be, for once, only a summer, Harry walked out alone onto the grounds in the long gold light and looked back at the castle where he had died once and would not now die again. He had the cloak folded in his bag and the stone quiet in his pocket and the elder wand hidden in his sleeve, 3 impossible things that 100 generations had murdered for, and he carried them the way you carry tools you have decided to use sparingly and put down at the end, which was, he had come to understand, the only way a person survived holding them. The war that had eaten his whole first life was not going to be fought. The people it would have killed were going to live. And the child who had been raised to die for a world that never thought to ask him had, instead, in a single stolen year, reached into the cradle of the future and remade it with his own small hands, and stood now on the threshold of a life that was, at last, entirely his own to spend. He thought, standing there, of the gray morning he had woken under the stairs with an ocean of a lost war pouring back into a body too small to hold it, and of the cold vow he had made in that cupboard before he had risen from the mattress, that he would not spend this life being moved, that he would move first, that he would take the board apart before the game began. He had done it, every piece of it. He had outmaneuvered the Dark Lord and the headmaster and the ministry and death itself, and he had done it not with a wand in the end, though he held the deadliest wand ever made, but with the one thing none of them had ever possessed and none of them had ever thought to guard against, the whole map of the future carried in the head of the last person any of them would ever suspect. It was, he had thought once, in a cupboard, an appalling amount to want. He had wanted it anyway. And now, in the gold light, with the war strangled and the dead unburied and the future a blank page waiting for a hand that was, for the first time, wholly his own, he found the wanting had not been appalling at all. It had only been a boy refusing to lose everyone twice. He stood a while in the failing light and took stock as he had taken stock on that first gray morning, except that the ledger read differently now. Then he had counted anchors and enemies and the long odds against a child. Now he counted a dark lord unmade, a war unfought, a godfather freed, a spy turned, two elves free, a bank at his back, a ministry bending to his design, and an old man in a tower who had, at the last, laid down the weight of the world and let a successor take it up. He counted the dead who were not dead, the graves that stood empty in a churchyard that would never need to dig them. And he counted the cost honestly, because a man who did not count the cost of his victories was a man who would one day spend more than he could pay. The ash of a professor in the black water, the man he had held while he burned, the things a soldier carried that did not wash off in either life. He had done hard things. He would do more in the years of building ahead, because building a better world was not a clean business, and the people who insisted it be clean were the people who left the work to men like Voldemort. Harry had learned that lesson in a war and would not unlearn it. But he had done the hard things in service of the empty graves and not for their own sake, and he could tell the difference. And as long as he could tell the difference, he was not and would never become the thing he had killed. The body was a child still and would be for years yet, and the mind was a war, and for the length of that gold evening the two of them stood together on the grounds, the old soldier and the young frame that carried him. And for once, for the first time since the ocean gave him back, neither one was at war with the other. He looked up at the castle, gold against the darkening mountains, and he permitted himself the single word he had earned across 2 lifetimes in one long war, and this time he said it aloud quietly to the evening and the stone and the child he had been and would never quite be again, and the word was enough. "One," Harry said. Then he turned and went down to the boats, and the last light of the day went with him, and behind him the castle held its 1,000 burning windows up against the coming dark, exactly as it always had, and did not know and would never know that the slight quiet figure walking down toward the water had already saved every soul inside it and asked in return for nothing at all. Chapter 7 End.